Hi, Vic. How are you?
Doing good, and you?
Very good.
Good. Thanks for being here. Corey, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
I'm 45 years old. I grew up in the mid-coast area of Maine, lived in the woods my whole life, and I was a Boy Scout. I always hunted. I was trapping all the time and camping. I like to travel. I've traveled all across the U.S. I've seen 42 out of the 50 states, and I specifically like Florida and Arizona.
As the listeners will hear, you've lived an exciting life. You're an explorer, you're a treasure hunter, you're a survivalist. Please tell us about those things.
When I was growing up, my mom used to joke that I like to live outdoors more than I like to live inside. I would leave her notes, I would say, I've gone camping and I should be back within 10 to 12 days. And after 12 days, mind you, this is when I'm 8 years old. And she would get worried after 12 days was up. But she always found me. So, yeah, I used to love to camp. I have a great love for nature. I've been a hunter my whole life. And I went to a environmental college, Unity College. It's in Unity, Maine. And that's where I really fell in love with hiking, camping. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail. I actually did it from south to north, which is unusual because most people start in Maine and hike to Georgia, but I did it the other way around. And then after that, I decided that I wanted to see some of the desert, and I moved to a place called Tortilla Flats, which is in the Superstition Mountains.
After hearing about all the strange things that go on in the Superstition Mountains, I can't imagine what kind of a sense of adventure you must have to want to move there.
Well, there's a legend about Jacob Waltz, and Jacob Waltz was a German miner who came to the West in the early 1800s and discovered a huge underground cave of gold. And it was said to have held $200,000 worth of gold in every square foot. And people have been looking for it for years. Some say they found it, but it was actually found and documented in the 1950s by two geologists, but they got lost on their way out and could never find it again. So I worked at Tortilla Flats and hiked, camped, and I loved the area so much that I moved back there in 2014.
With your sense of adventure, I can understand why you'd move back. When was the first time you heard the term dogman?
The first time that I heard the term dogman, I think I was searching YouTube and I came across your site and I thought, well, let me rephrase that. The song The Michigan Dogman was probably the first time. And then I looked it up on YouTube to see what it was about, and I wanted to see if it was the animal that I encountered.
And that's when you found out that it was.
I believe it was, yes.
Yeah, it sure seems to be that way. The first night you moved into your new home, something strange happened. Please tell us about that.
Okay. The first night that I got to my new home, there was a pregnant cat that was outside of my house, and I was watching it waddle through the driveway, and all of a sudden a very large black shadow ran across and grabbed it. It happened so fast, and it was so big that I didn't know what to think about it. At first I thought it was a mountain lion, but it wasn't. It had too many dog-like features.
Were you able to get a good enough look at that dog man to be able to tell how long its fur was? Also, what did its ears look like?
It definitely had pointed ears. Honestly, it had to have been 5.5 to 6 feet long with a very long tail, and it was jet black. It was so dark and so fast, it actually was quite amazing that I could see it as fast as it was.
Well, that's pretty unsettling. I'm sure for some time, anytime you'd go out at night, that had to be the first thing you would think about.
Yeah, that and the concern was that there was also a large mountain lion in the area, which I did also encounter, but she was pretty friendly towards humans, so I didn't really fear her. But there was a couple of times when I was walking outside and I felt like I was being watched by something. The owner of the property asked me, because I'm a hunter and a trapper, she asked me to try to figure out where the mountain lion was coming through. Well, one night I was sitting in what they call a wash out there, and the washes are basically just runoff from where the rains and the monsoons come through. Well, I was standing there waiting for any animals to come through when I saw 3 figures start to walk down the path. And at first I thought they were probably thieves trying to steal either boat parts or break into houses and loot places. But as they got closer, they looked strange, and they disappeared so quickly that I never really did get a very good look at them. They must have either seen me or smelt me. I think possibly that was the first time that I encountered the dogman. The second time was much closer.
How close did you say you were to those 3 figures at your closest point?
Well, I was on the beach hiding in the trees waiting for what I thought was going to be a mountain lion. And when I saw them walking down, they were walking upright and they were walking strange, almost, I would almost say like hobbling, almost like a drunk person. And I would say I was probably about 300 yards from them. And I got a little nervous because I had no weapons, and I wasn't really afraid of the mountain lion. That's just par for the course in the desert. So I decided that I was outnumbered, and I went and told my boss, and I said, we need to get some security out here. But we never did see them again.
What kind of lighting conditions did you have that night?
Well, the resort is pretty well lit up. There's only a few areas that don't have overhead halogen lighting, and for the most part, people stick to the paths that have the lights. And there's a few places where there's absolutely no lights there, and yeah, that's probably where the predators hunt. The place is called Apache Lake, and it was a very special place. The story that I was told by the local forest ranger, who I was very good friends with, was that the Apaches weren't allowed to go there. Only the medicine men were. So I found that very interesting because it's a perfect place for survival. You have water, you have mountains for protection. If there's enemies there, you can hide really well. There's caves. And there's a lot of things there. In 1967, there was a person called Jack, I think his last name was Schuster, Jack Schuster. Jack Schuster actually built a resort, and he had 2 children. He had 2 daughters, Monica and Kathy. And after Jack passed, he was buried on the property. And the first night that I actually moved out there and I got the job, I actually got the job on Craigslist, which amazed me. And you have to picture this place is really remote. It's a 2.5-hour drive. There's only one way in and one way out. It's about 2.5 hours through canyons. And when I got there, the first night, I wanted to just sort of walk around and check it out. And people always told me that Jack's spirit was still there. So I ended up walking down to what they call Jack's Cove. It's a little inlet. And while I was down there, I was sitting on a rock with my feet dangling in the water. It was a full moonlit night, and all of a sudden, this huge carp, which is basically a large sunfish, if you don't know what a carp is, came out of the water, and as strange as it sounds, I swear it looked me right in the eye, and the thing had to have weighed 100 pounds. Needless to say, I kind of felt like Jack's spirit was welcoming me to the property. But I still took my toes out of the water.
Yeah, I don't blame you there. That'd be quite the experience.
Oh yeah, that fish was huge, and it could easily have drowned me.
Oh, I'll bet it could have. When you had the encounter we're about to talk about now, Corey, you were working at a resort. What can you tell us about the resort, and what can you tell us about the encounter you had?
The resort is brand new. It's leased off the federal government Bureau of Land Management. And it's been owned by one family since the 1970s. It's 2.5 hours from any store, any gas station. It's very, very remote. It's a very, very deep lake. It's surrounded by canyons. It's absolutely beautiful. It has a marina. It has 3 hotels. It has a restaurant, a full bar, and a playground. And also it has places where you can store your boats and wet slips and dry slips. They pay you every 2 weeks. It was a great job. One thing they do is they have events there. They have a music festival that happens every year. They have NA and CA events that also happen there, AA events. But the event where my encounter happened was called the Johnson Memorial. And it's been going on for 15 or 20 years at this point. They're lots of fun, and we look forward to seeing them every year. Well, one night after working in the restaurant, I waited tables and I bartended and I did a lot of other things. I was sort of a jack of all trades there, if you will. I went home and me and a friend sat around and we were playing guitar and just actually they were still cooking at, I think this was around 2 or 3 in the morning. Well, it was about 3 o'clock. And we were eating, I think it was steaks and sausages, and they were really good people. Me and my friend were playing guitar, and he had to work the next day. I was off. So everyone started calling it a night, and it started quieting down. It was a moonlit night, and I just didn't feel like going to bed. The great thing about this resort is that there's walking trails everywhere. So I decided to go for a walk, but I didn't get very far. I had an efficiency apartment underneath one of the hotels, and I was walking up towards the marina restaurant when I passed through the parking lot that's next door to my apartment, and I heard all kinds of commotion I was actually looking over, and I actually saw this big white van. It was violently shaking, and I thought, what's going on here? I better check, because part of our job is security, too. So I started walking over, and I saw what, well, it took a while for my mind to process it. I saw what first looked like a very, very large guy wearing a jacket that would be something like a fur coat or something. Well, I got a little bit closer because it was becoming apparent to me that this person didn't own the vehicle. So I thought possibly they were trying to steal the vehicle. We've had vehicles stolen there. Or they were robbing them. So I got a little bit closer, and then I hesitated because I realized that the jacket wasn't a jacket at all. It was actual hair. At that point, I think what I would call a dog man smelled me because his head turned and cocked. He never actually turned his face so I could see it. But I could see his arms and his paws, and the best description I've heard is the raccoon hands. They really did look to me like they were human hands, but they had long nails. I will not forget that. And I did see one eye, and it was red. I took another step a little bit closer just to make sure that I wasn't mistaken, because I thought maybe it was two people and I was misinterpreting the situation. So I actually yelled, "Hey, is that your van, and what are you doing?" And that's when it growled at me. I knew immediately that it wasn't a cinnamon bear, because there's another animal in the desert called a cinnamon bear. But this was upright on two legs, and it was literally digging through the van, and it was throwing stuff behind it. At that point, I realized that I was encountering something that I had never, ever heard of or seen before. It wasn't a javelina, it wasn't a cinnamon bear, and it wasn't a mountain lion for sure. And so it growled at me again, and I stopped in my tracks at that point. And I decided, well, I guess tonight's not a great night for a walk. So I started to back up, and I ran from my apartment and locked the door. That was pretty much my encounter.
After you had that encounter, who was the first person you told about it?
I told the owners about it, but I didn't tell them that I thought that it was a dog man. I told them, and here's the strange thing. The van was gone in the morning by like 6:30 in the morning. Those people packed up and left, and they must have been pretty scared because most people hang around all day. It's a beautiful spot. So I went up and I told my boss, I said, listen, I said I was out for a walk last night and I saw somebody rifling through somebody's van, and they called the police, but nothing really became of it because the van had already left. They left so early. They must have been frightened because I'm not really sure what happened to the van, but I do remember seeing just before I ran off scratch marks on the side of it. I assumed it was probably from a car accident, or it's pretty easy to scratch your vehicle going down. These roads are narrow and there's lots of sharp, jagged rocks, but now that I think about it, I think probably this thing was trying to open the door and damage the vehicle.
I wonder if the people who owned that van weren't watching from a distance, and after that dog man took off, they got into the van and headed out themselves.
You know what? That's possible because now that you mention it, there's an upper and a lower parking lot, and the van was in the lower parking lot, and the upper parking lot overlooks the lower parking lot. And there was a little dog. I do remember that it came out and it was barking at this thing, and then it just ran off. So I think it realized that it was not a person, and that probably did bring out the owners, and they probably saw something that they couldn't explain.
Yeah, that just might be how it went down. Through all this, were you able to see its ears?
Yeah, I could see the ears. The best description I have heard is German Shepherd. I never saw a snout, which speaks to its intelligence, because when I yelled, "Hey, what are you doing?" it knew better than to turn and look at me and let me see its face. It actually cocked its head, and I could see teeth, too, when it growled at me. I didn't see them very well, but it was clearly canine teeth. I saw a red eye, and I saw ears that were German Shepherd-like. And I gotta tell you, the van was a 350 heavy-duty van, and it had a side door that opened. And this dog man absolutely filled that side door, and that had to have been at least 4 feet wide.
Wow, if it filled up that side door like that, then yeah, it wasn't exactly a small specimen. I think you indirectly answered this question already from what you just said, but could you tell what color it was?
It was dark colored, but it also had orange, reddish hair, too. But that could have been the fluorescent color, because the parking lots are pretty well lit up. I'm curious as to why it picked this van, whether there was food in there or what exactly it was doing.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like typical dogman behavior, but you never do know what they're going to do. Was that van parked by itself or around other vehicles?
No, it was parked next to several other vehicles with boats attached to them, because it's a popular lake. Everybody brings their boats out there. One thing I did happen to think about is that the parking lot that it was in, there is a natural arroyo that leads right up to it. So it would be really easy for an animal, and I used to see the deer and the javelina cross there all the time. It's about 50 feet from the parking lot to the water's edge. And then from the parking lot, it's only about 20 feet to the wilderness. This property is 88 acres, and it's spread out quite a bit. The restaurant's on top of the hill. The marina is at the bottom of the hill. The parking and tenting sites are next to the marina. And then you have the wet slips, which are by Jack's Cove. Yeah, so if that gives you an idea, and almost everything is walking uphill and doing circles. Most of these trails and places can be reached by circular roads. So you can take one path to one place and then hop on another circular path and reach another one. But they are pretty well spread out. The distance from the marina to the restaurant is probably about 800 yards. So it's a pretty good sized resort. And there's a lot of beach, and there's a lot of game there too. I would always wake up in the morning and I would see either javelina or deer or quail walking to the water to get a drink. So I assume that's what attracted it.
It does sound like a really nice place to go. How far were you from any place of safety like a building when you saw that dog man?
Oh, I wasn't very far at all. I was actually still on the walking path that went to my apartment. 200 feet, 250 feet. It was very close, which is what shocked me the most. But obviously these things are not at all afraid of humans, because I'm pretty sure that they could do whatever they wanted to us. I mean, he had to weigh 450 pounds.
You said you were about 200 to 250 feet away from your apartment. If that dogman had decided to get nasty, that might as well have been a mile.
Yep. Yes, it would have. But I'm an avid outdoorsman. I can tell when an animal is going to attack or if it's just warning me off. It was just warning me off. I know it's human nature and it's crazy, but I wanted to get closer to look at this thing. And I just knew that if I did that, that it would attack me.
Were any other people around when this happened?
I don't think so, but after I mentioned the dog and how fast those people left, it is possible that there was somebody above that looked down and saw this thing. I never saw them because my eyes were transfixed on it. Obviously, I've listened to several of the shows. I skip around a little bit, so I've listened to like 50 through 125, but I'm still trying to listen to like the 40s and stuff. But I feel like you're right. I feel like maybe somebody was above and saw this thing, and they decided in the morning that they would never come back. But, you know, there are things out there that are unexplainable, and you can't live your life in fear of what might happen and what might not happen, because you're going to end up secluded and never having any adventures or exploring, which is my passion. I'm a wilderness guide, and I am a mountaineer. I like to cave, and I've had several other incidents that don't even include dogmen. So that place is clearly a magical spot, because I believe that there's other things out there that man has never seen, and it's about 600,000 acres of mountainous terrain, and if you don't know where water is and you don't have enough water, you're not making it back out. Food isn't that hard to find. Water, pretty hard to find.
Did you ever try to find out if any other dogman encounters happened in that area?
I haven't heard anything about that, but I know just before I moved out to Arizona, before my dogman encounter, that there was another major Sasquatch sighting, and it was all over the news. A lot of people were calling it a hoax, but I knew the people, and they told me, they were like, this was no hunter in a ghillie suit. They were like, this was a Sasquatch. And I've known these people for years. They wouldn't make up something like that. They're not interested in the public eye or anything like that. And they got some great pictures, too. It happened in Turner, Maine. And it literally happened after I left.
Yeah, sounds like that area's got a lot of activity. After you caught that dogman rifling through that van, how much work did you put into researching dogmen?
Well, let's see. That was at Johnson Memorial. I tried to track it. And for about another week after that happened, I tried to track it. And one night, the same thing happened to me. There was a game trail that was behind the resort. And I was sitting up there, and I was waiting to see if I could see this thing again. because an animal that big, even if they are stealthy, they have to break branches. This one was at least 400 pounds. But when I was on the trail, something growled at me again, and I know it was the same creature. There's rumors that the Mayan grave site is still being protected by ancient Indian spirits, and that some of them actually still live and continue to live up there. I never saw any actual Indians, but I did go to the Mayan grave site. The legend is, and I hope everyone takes this to heart, the legend is that if you remove a rock or any type of memorabilia from the Superstition Mountains, you will have bad luck. And that is the truth.
Well, that's a scary thought. You told me that the Mayan burial site isn't all that far from that resort. Do you know exactly how far it is?
It is about a 45-minute walk.
Ooh, that's not that far. That's about 3 miles then.
It's not even quite that far, but it's uphill.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, that's really close. Were there ever any other times in your life when you think there might have been a dogman near you?
There's only one other thing I can think of, and I was a child, and I honestly couldn't tell you whether it was a dream or whether I actually saw this thing. I woke up in the middle of the night, and we had a big picture window, and this is in Maine. I looked out by our front lawn, and there was a giant gray, I didn't call them dogmen at that point. I thought it was a werewolf. This one was much larger than the one that I saw in Arizona. It was probably a good 10 feet tall. And I saw that one very good. So I don't know whether or not it was my imagination, because it's sounding like some of these are being almost like a guardian angel, because if they wanted to hurt us, they sure could. Because the one that I saw in Arizona, the claws on it would rip someone open no problem. Again, I didn't really see the face. It knew to keep it hidden from me, and when it growled, I knew in my own mind if I had stepped forward that it would have turned around, and then I wouldn't have stood a chance because it would have outrun me, even at 200 feet.
I'm so glad you realized that. How sure are you that you weren't dreaming when you looked out that front window and saw that 10-foot werewolf in the front yard that night?
It's very hard to be sure that I wasn't sleeping, because I had gotten up to go to the bathroom. I would say probably 7 or 8 years old. We lived in a ranch house, and it overlooked a really big green grass lawn, and it is possible that it wasn't a dream. I've got to be honest. It was probably the most impressive creature I've ever seen. And I looked at it, and it looked at me, and I've heard other people say this, but it almost looked like it smiled at me. And it took one giant leap, and I would say it covered a good 20 or 30 feet in that leap. It was a huge animal. I would like to believe that it wasn't a dream.
Dogmen bigger than that have been reported by very credible eyewitnesses, so I guess we'll never know.
My friend once told me that he thought that I had some type of hidden talent, and this is my best friend telling me this. He thought that I was able to find and call animals. I don't know if there's a name for that or not, but he's always said that. The first day that we went off to college, I told him about a giant moose that had literally walked right by me. It actually almost had to step over me. he didn't believe me, and when we got in my car and drove up the road, the moose was coming out of a fog bank in the field. He's like, "Is that the moose you saw?" And I said, "Yeah, it walked right by me." And he's like, "How do you do that?" And I said, I don't know. I kind of feel like nature and I are connected somehow. A lot of people say that some empaths can communicate with the animals. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I would love to believe that.
Well, it does make you wonder if there's something to that or not. Are the dogman encounters we've been talking about tonight the reason why you left that area?
No, actually, the reason I left that area is I found another job. But who's to say I won't see another one, because I'm in the Adirondacks now. And I know that, what's the name of the North American Dogmen Association? Is that right?
North American Dogman Project.
Yes. They're in Pennsylvania, right?
Well, they have several investigators in Pennsylvania from what I understand, but no, they're not based in Pennsylvania. They're based out of Ohio.
Okay, because I'm at the foot of the Adirondacks, and I was listening to one of your shows, and I have been to this area that it was the encounter where the people, some of them were military and some of them were firefighters, and there were two brothers, and they were at a campsite that I go to all the time. In fact, I'm intending on going up there again. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, that's the episode where this actually happened in upstate New York. I can't remember the number of that episode, but yeah, it was maybe 3-4 weeks ago.
Oh, it was that recent?
Yeah, it was pretty recent. The eyewitness's name is Tyler, I believe.
I'm pretty sure that's the exact spot that I'm going camping, because I've been dying to get up there. And it makes perfect sense they would be up there, because there are tons of animals and wildlife up there, and it's very remote. I don't think they dislike people. I think they just want to try to keep their species secret so that they're not hunted, because people would love to try to go out and hunt these things. They're foolish.
Yeah, that would be a mistake. And they have attacked people, so that says everything that we need to know about whether they're safe to be around or not.
Yeah, I'm writing a story specifically about what happened to me with the Sasquatch. It's just going to be a short story. I actually have the painting all done. I'm trying to promote my artwork, and I like to paint artwork that has cryptids in it, so I wanted to email you some, and I'd love to have some people give me some feedback.
That sounds good. If you get those sent to me, I'll post those on the YouTube version of the show so the listeners can check them out.
Yeah, the Sasquatch came out really good. The Dogman is still a work in progress.
Oh, that's all right. No, I think they just would love to see them in the first place. Well, Corey, it's about time for us to get out of here. Before we do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Yeah, I wanted to say, I know I've mentioned the place, it's Apache Lake Marina and Resort, but please respect those people and don't expect to go up there and have some type of cryptic encounter, because this could have just been a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and I just would like people to respect them and the area. And also remember, there's an old Apache curse that if you remove something from the Superstition Mountains, you will have bad luck. So just beware of that.
Thanks again so much for coming on the show tonight, Corey. I really do appreciate your time.
Thank you, Vic. I really had a great time.
Oh, it's been great talking with you. Have a great night, okay?
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to listen to the show without commercial interruptions, please go to dogmanencountersradio.com and visit the How to Listen page to find out more about becoming a premium member. As you'll see on that page, the subscription fee for becoming a premium member is $2.99 a month. If you want to listen to the show free of charge and don't mind the commercials, the Dogman Encounters YouTube channel is what you're looking for. As always, thanks for listening. Instead of airing a normal show tonight, I've put together over 3 hours of non-stop Dogman Encounters for you. They're from recent popular episodes. I hope you enjoy the show. The first segment's from episode 112, Dave Lighty.
I had come up to Vermont thinking I was going to relax. My wife and I and our dog Kaiser up to our place in northeast Vermont. It's a nice log home on about 15 acres. I'll tell you, if you've never been to Vermont, you should go. Weather's perfect. People are perfect. Well, like I said, I thought I was going to come up and relax. The summers in Vermont, about 100 days, so a little tough to get used to, but definitely makes up for it. So, like I said, originally I had planned on just coming up and relaxing, but I did get a phone call when I was up here from the North American Dogman Project, and they had asked me to field calls if any had come my way. So with that, I'm really happy to be working for them and helping people who might be having trouble with the whole thing. So anyway, I figured I could cover at least the whole northeast corner of Vermont, depending on where these calls came from. I didn't think I'd get any, but I was wrong. As it turned out, the one that I did check out was near the northeast Canadian border, somewhere near Averill. The other one was about an hour southeast, maybe near, if I had to put a town on it, I'd say Hardwick. So I drove to meet this guy, and his name was Keno, and he lives a few miles from the Canadian border near what he said was the Continental Divide. I had no idea that there was such a thing as a Continental Divide in Vermont. Still not quite sure that there is, but that's what people call it up there. When you're up there, at one point, you stand on this ridge line between two lakes, and the river, or the water from the stream, runs in two different directions. One goes east into the one lake, and the other water runs west into the other lake, and they call it the Continental Divide. I don't know what that is. But this guy had a great log home on 53 acres of land. Everything on it was completely off the grid. He had water and wind and solar power. The other thing that really impressed me about his house was that he had an observatory. And he told me that on clear nights he could sit up in the observatory, and if the stars were right, he could see the colors of the northern lights, which I thought was pretty cool. He said he bought the place about 6 or 7 years ago, and he lives there by himself with his two dogs. Like me, he occasionally has friends come over and stay as long as they wish, and he also has a pretty nice on-off-road truck and ATVs and snow machines, and these are the kind of things you definitely need in that area. So we sat and we talked about all kinds of things, and we talked about his encounter. He told me that nothing really strange had ever happened until recently. He said he sits down at the house at night and drives around his ATV, and everything's pretty normal. And he said this one time he decided that he was going to go solo camping in a small trailer. And he said he camped about 15 miles from his house in some woods just over the New Hampshire border. After a couple of days, while he was camping there, he went out to collect some wood. He was out near an old quarry, and he thought he saw a dark figure walk into the tree line. And he said he got a pretty good look at it, and he got kind of frightened. He started to second guess himself. He said it looked like an upright walking wolf or a dog. And at this point he said something strange to me in French. He said that it was a loup-garou. I had never heard of that before, and I asked him to spell it. He said it was spelled Loup, as a lougarou. I'd heard of something called a rougarou, but I'd never heard of this one. And he went on to recount this whole French legend about the lougarou. He said that the word loup is a French word that means wolf, and garou is an old Frankish word similar to werewolf. He said the legend says that when a person contacts a lougarou and it draws blood, the lougarou changes back to a human form, but the victim then becomes a lougarou for 101 days. If that guy talks about it to anyone, he becomes a lougarou forever, and if he doesn't, he'll turn back to a human. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Never heard anything like that before. Anyway, he said he didn't chase it. He decided he might be wrong. Maybe it was a bear. So he went back to his campsite. During the night, he heard snarling and a howl, and a bit later he heard some scratching on the trees, and he heard some things being moved around after he had gone back into his trailer. Looking out his window, he said he didn't see anything obvious, but some blurred movement. So the next morning, he got up, he went outside, he found that the blur was that all his camp furniture had been thrown into the woods. The scratching that he heard was a lot like the way bears scratch trees, except the scratching was through the bark and deep into the tree. And he said that he always thought that the bears would remove the bark from the tree. So he thought that was really strange. He also found some damage to his truck. So he decided that he would cut his trip short and go home that day. So he took the long route through some of the back dirt roads of Vermont and thought about what was going on as he was driving back there and got on home. Those back roads of Vermont are pretty interesting. They go past old and new hunting camps. They follow the power lines. Some of them even come out at old radar bases. So you can get seriously lost back there. There's no markings or anything. So it's pretty cool place to go. I personally spent a lot of time on those roads. It's really a great way to spend the day. You never really see anybody else, and you forever lose and find yourself all day long. Just ride around getting lost all the time. It's good to have a truck, though, I'll tell you that. Besides being lazy, watching moose, and going out to rural gun ranges, fishing, paddling around, I love to explore Vermont. It really justifies all the money I spend on my truck. After a while, it might even prove their worth to my wife. So exploring, it really lets you know how vast and remote and how unknown the whole area is. I've seen a lot of animals out there. I've seen all kinds of stuff. This one time I was up by Canada on a power line road, and within 20 minutes I saw a mountain lion, a bear, and a bobcat. So this stuff is out there. If you're slow and if you're quiet, it'll show itself to you. But it also lets you know how remote you are. But it's rare. You know, moose, deer, bear, you see most of that. Fisher cats, they're around, but you don't see them much. You just hear them. Middle of the night, it sounds like something's axe murdered in the trees. So, anyway, Kino says he took these roads home during the day, and he admitted that his imagination had him seeing dark figures in every tree line. And what he said is he never felt that way before. He had lived in the area for 7 years, and never before had he felt the slightest trepidation about being there. So, after about a week at home, he had almost forgotten about it. A neighbor asked him soon if he had seen anything weird. So before he could answer, the neighbor told him about all this snarling and howling and a few fresh deer kills by the woods where this other guy was camping. So he drove to the guy's house about 5 miles away, and they went to the camp, and they saw the deer kills, and while they were standing there, they thought they heard a snarl coming from the woods. Kino told me, he said he'd been growled at before by various creatures. Skunks and fisher cats sometimes growl at you. He said, but this was different. He said to me that it sounded like steam escaping from a water vessel. They decided to get out of there and think about it. They considered calling the police or the game warden, but decided against that. They both were Squatch guys, and they thought it might have been a crypto. The neighbor said that he knew a guy that worked for a crypto group, and that's how I got involved. So, when I arrived, I talked to Keno and I assured him that the North American Dogman Project would take him seriously. We'd respect everything about the issue and try and help him. He wanted to know what it was and how to keep it from his area. None of us really ever heard of anything up here, except maybe Sasquatch. I know that decades ago there were some disappearances near Bennington, Vermont, but not much after that. So, at this point, I decided to check it out. I wrote up the initial report with Keno and I decided that I was going to take a look in the area. It might be nothing. No one had really seen anything. I mean, not anything for sure. So, I went with him and a neighbor and we checked out the deer kills at the camp and couldn't really tell if anything other than a normal predator had done that. I mean, there weren't any tracks. There wasn't anything that would have said anything different. So, I was going to go out, and I decided to bring my friend Ernest with me. We talked about it, and we said we were going to go and do some camping in the area and see what we'd see. So, we brought our supplies, camping gear, fishing gear. He brought his bass boat, and it's a good chance we'd maybe get some fish, maybe some trout or perch, walleye, landlocked salmon. There's all kinds of stuff around there. So, we did that, and of course we also brought some weapons. I had since upgraded my 357 to a 44, and Ernest had a Desert Eagle 50 caliber, and I thought, oh, that's good. He also was bringing a lever action 30-30. So we went to the range beforehand, day beforehand, and decided to hone our skills a little bit. So the other thing we need to do is to approach this in a methodical manner. First, I wanted to make sure what we were dealing with. I always go into these encounters with the idea that the issue is completely unexplainable, then go from there. Ernest was telling me about coy dogs. So apparently in Vermont, coyotes have bred with local wild dogs, and the result is a larger, rather fearless coyote with no fear of humans. And that's pretty scary, but not the dogman. So we decided to drive the back roads. The first place we were going to stop was a Vermont state park that we knew, and try that first. The first day and night, we didn't encounter anything. We didn't have any fish either, but we camped, a nice fire, nice food, slept peacefully through the night. The only noise was the other campers around us. So the next morning we broke camp and moved on and camped in the backwoods that I had described before. Deep, dark, and wild in those roads back there. But still nothing. The only thing that we really encountered was there was 4 guys went by on horses who said they were camping nearby. Woods were quiet. Still, mist clinging to low areas. Just normal Vermont environments. The only thing we heard was a couple of night birds, great horned owl, insects, small mammals, stuff you'd expect to hear. So, again, we just had a cooking fire, let it go out. Good night's sleep. Third night, we camped in a cornfield just over the New Hampshire border. And I got to tell you, that was the weirdest camping of my entire life. I had camped all over the place, in all kinds of different areas, and I will never camp in another cornfield. I got to tell you that. It was just odd. You're in the middle of the cornfield and nothing around you but corn stalks. And the noise comes from all different areas. The surprised creatures run in and out of the area that you are, and the light filters down in odd ways. You would never think that a cornfield would be that odd, but I got to tell you, never again. So just before we were bedding down for the night for that, well, that's another thing. Are we bedding down for the night or are we sleeping on corn stalks? Well, either way. We were just about to drop off to sleep and we heard one very long, distant howl. That was weird. But again, we dropped off to sleep. So we thought maybe it could have been a coy dog after he was just talking about that and what our conversation was on earlier. But again, we dropped off to sleep. The next day, we broke camp as much as it was, and we traveled off maybe like northeast of the campground we were at, the cornfield we were at. And we were just meandering through the back roads of New Hampshire now. So we found our way to the edge of a decent-sized lake. Ernest called this place the Gore. And I thought that was interesting. And I asked him what that meant. He said that a gore is a place that exists because of a mistake made by a colonial surveyor. He said originally the land was owned by no one, but technically the state had taken control of it, but still it was basically uninhabited. There was something else out here. The place was pretty remote, but it showed signs of recent logging activity. A lot of times a landowner will sell an acre or two of hardwood deep in the woods, clear it, and then replant it. That way the clear cut isn't really noticeable, except from the air. Then after about 20 years or so, it's well on its way to growing back. So I'd say that most of the timber on the East Coast was cut down from wherever it was, virgin forest, over the last 200 years. To say that there's very few old-growth stands anywhere on the East Coast is probably saying something. I know there's pockets. I know there's a great pocket of hemlocks in Pennsylvania, Cook Forest, and there's some other areas that have been reserved, but not many. So this place was old. It looked though it hadn't been cut in about 100 years, and that's pretty rare. I mean, usually every 40 or 50 years is more like it will stand, but maybe it's because it was a gore. Who knows? Some places in this gore were really thick, and it looked like they hadn't been touched at all. But there was also some recent activity. It looked as though like about an acre was cut, and then they started on the second acre and then just stopped. There were cut trees laying there, and a couple of them had some branches lopped off, but even weirder, some of the tools were left on the ground. Ernest and I looked at each other and thought, uh-oh. I mean, I'd seen that once in a haunted house where the workers had just dropped their stuff and ran when something spooked them. And this felt just like that. It was a really creepy feeling that we hadn't really noticed before. Kind of a semi-watched feeling. So we were up all night because we'd already been spooked, and we had a nice bonfire going, and there was a lot of old cut seasoned wood lying around, so we sat up talking. And a little later in the night, we heard a barred owl in the distance, and he was answered by a much closer one, and we were listening to them for a while. Then the wind picked up, and I'll tell you, the wind picked up and the fire shadows looked really weird. The shadows were dancing around and kind of freaking us out. They looked really bizarre. And then, after a while, the wind died down, and just then the owl sounded off loud and really close. Warning hoots scared the crap out of us. He did it about 8 or 9 times, and then he stopped. So, slowly the regular noises came back, and we started to relax. And after about 20 minutes, all the noise stopped. Silence. We looked at each other. Hair stood up on the back of my neck. We heard a snarl, so I snapped my holster. We started to hear crunching noises, sticks snapping, breathing sounds. I mouthed to Ernest, "Bear?" And he shook his head. And I nodded, and he still shook his head. And I was hoping bear, but I kind of knew they were all vegetarians around here. Not that they wouldn't pass up meat, but that wasn't very usual for them. So I shrugged. And what else? Humans? Maybe. Then no noise again. Complete silence. Felt like we were being watched. Definitely watched. Intently. It lasted for over an hour. Then the forest noise would start up again. And then it would stop again. And it was weird. It went on like this all night long. There was no way we were sleeping this night. So this thing went on and off, like I said, all night long. So we kept the fire going strong, and we just kept looking around. We'd hear low snarls. Once in a while, we'd hear a sound like metal being smacked, but couldn't really see anything. So just about dawn, all the forest noise came back up like a switch was thrown. And everything seemed normal. By this time, we were totally wired. So we decided to fish instead of sleep. I mean, we were wired up. We were wound. We were freaked. We were delirious. Take your pick. But we launched the bass boat, and we went out maybe 100 yards from shore. So we were out there about 2 hours. No bites. It was maybe 9 o'clock in the morning by this time. I was just starting to think that something was nibbling my bait, and I got Ernest's attention. I saw a dark shape over by the truck in our campsite, and we both got a real good look at it. I'd say we were about 40 yards out, drifting in. At first, we thought it was a dog, and then we thought it was a bear. It disappeared, and just as we started to think it disappeared, it showed itself again. It came right out toward the shoreline, kind of half hidden by the bushes. It looked like it didn't see us. It was bent over, and then it just kind of stood up. There was no popping sound at all. It just stood up. Maybe it was already up. It moved a big, large tree branch out of its way like it was nothing. And then it looked right at us. It was like a knife to my stomach. There was intelligence in that look. It was about 8 feet tall, maybe 3 feet wide at the shoulder. It had a German Shepherd type head, a very pointed kind of fuzzy ears on top of its head, and a long muzzle. It had muscular arms and legs and kind of a thin body. It was black, kind of furry. And the fur was thick around its head and shoulders, but thin around its stomach. I really couldn't see its backside, but I could see a tail hanging behind it, kind of between his legs. We couldn't really tell eye color, and they weren't really glowing, but it was pretty bright daylight, so maybe we just couldn't tell. Couldn't see his feet, but his paws were more like hands with long claws on each finger. I just really was kind of in a state of shock. It was broad daylight, and we were seeing this thing. And another weird thing is it seemed to have like darkness around it. It wasn't like a cloud or anything. It just looked kind of fuzzy. And maybe because of how dark its fur was. The other weird thing is it seemed to have a patch of red on its right shoulder. I mean, we were still about 40 yards out, but you could see it. It looked like a bright red spot on his shoulder, and it didn't look like fur. It sort of looked like a piece of cloth about 4 inches in diameter, maybe rectangle shaped. I couldn't see it very well, but it was definitely red. So it stood there for about 2 more minutes by a tree. We were looking at it, and it's looking at us. It showed its fangs, made a growling, kind of a gurgling noise, looked both ways, shook a little bit like a dog does, and then just took off running. We thought about staying right there in the boat for the rest of the day. But after a few minutes, we came in. And we brought the boat in and we looked around. We didn't see anything. We went down to where he was standing by the lake, and we saw one track, and it had to be his. It was pretty fresh. They looked like wolf tracks, but kind of bigger. The ground was rocky and dry except by the water, so we found one good one. So we looked back up in the woods where we thought it went, but there was nothing there, and we went down the path a ways, but nothing there either, and we decided against tracking. Maybe if we had more people, we could have. Maybe not. At this point, we decided to pack it up and go. That's when we noticed there was damage to the truck. It was really kind of weird. There was these matching crunch marks, like someone had pinched the back of the bed rails together. And there was a big dent, like someone had kicked the body in right above the tailpipe. Well, we took pictures of everything, and we took some notes, and decided to pack it in and head home. Had a lot to think about, a lot to write up.
Episode 116, Josh Turner.
When I was working, I worked for a large company that builds homes in and around the Austin area. I can't give the name of it, of course, but it's a client of ours, and they have a lot of contractors that work for them. Working for these companies, we're there late at night. We get there in the early evening, and we're there all night, and we're there till the morning. And most of the contractors arrive before we leave, so you get to know the people that work there. And you become friends with them, a lot of them. If you're doing your job, usually they like that you're there and you guard their stuff. They can leave their stuff there. They know that it's not going to get stolen. And we have a pretty good track record. We've worked for a lot of big companies. And so I got to be friends with a few of these contractors, and that's how I met the people that I'm going to talk about today. These stories were given to me back in like June, but I haven't had a chance to scratch my head, much less get in touch with you to tell you, hey, I got some information. And at the time, I like to hear people's encounters, any kind of paranormal encounters, whether it's ghosts or anything. I'll listen to somebody talk about that, and sometimes I guess I can be steering the conversation that way just to see if I can find something from somebody that knows about something that may have happened to them. But this particular gentleman that I'm going to talk about, we became friends. And the reason that me and him began to talk about this subject is because he heard me listening to your show. I was listening to your show one morning and he came in. He was standing outside talking to the guy that does the sod. This guy that I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to call him Jerry and I'm going to call him Hernandez. That's not his real name, but I told him that I have permission to tell his stories, but I don't really want to say his real name because I don't want people harassing him or going onto his property. When I was listening to your show, he came up to me and we started talking and your show was playing and I work so much that I have to work out on post. So when I'm out in the post, a lot of times I'll take my kettlebells and my weights and I'll be out there lifting. I usually wait until right before dawn to do it. So I was out there lifting and it sounds kind of silly, but you have to stay in shape. So anyways, he comes up to me and he starts BSing with me like he always does. The show was playing and there was one of your guests. I'm not going to mention it, whatever, but he was listening. He kind of started listening and he goes, what is she talking about? And I said, it's a show called, and for a minute there, I thought this guy's he's going to think I'm crazy. You know what I mean? Like I didn't want to start, I didn't start going, hey, yeah, I saw something and did you see anything? That's not how it happened. It just kind of happened naturally. And I told him, I said, what's a show? It's called Dogman Encounters. And he just at first he kind of laughed, like kind of scoffed. And I thought, oh man, this dude, he already thinks this is silly. So I cut it off. No offense, Vic, but I cut the show off. And so we started talking and he's like, what is a dogman? Like, what is that? And I started to describe it to him. I said, well, what it is these people go on this show. And at that point, I didn't tell him that I'd been on your show. I said, these people go on this show and they talk about their encounters. They see these things that look like werewolves. And he's like, really? And I said, yeah, but the term has become a catch-all term for any of these creatures that people see. It's called dogman. And he's like, dogman. I said, yeah, that's what it's called. And he was like, well, that's interesting. He's like, now these dogmen, what do they look like? And I said, well, it varies. People see different versions of this, but roughly it's a werewolf. That's what it looks like, a traditional werewolf, something on two legs. At that point, he kind of snapped to, and he was like, holy, I don't want to say the curse word, but holy crap. He goes, we've been seeing these things on my property since I was a kid. And that's when I asked him, I was like, where do you live? And he's like, I live, and he told me, outside of Austin, and I'll give you the town that it's close by to, but that's as far as I'm going to go, near Wimberley. It's out by the Blanco River. It's outside of Wimberley. So anyway, he tells me they had been seeing these things for a long time. And when I asked him to elaborate further, I said, well, have you seen anything? Did you see something? He's like, yeah. He's like, I saw one time and that was it. He's like, but my family can tell you a lot of different stories about this. Now his family works with him. He's the foreman for his crew. They install the cabinets and do the counters and all that. And his uncle, his dad's youngest brother, he works with him, and so does his other brother, his younger brother. But they were working on a different site. And that other site I worked at periodically too. Wherever I was needed, I would fill in. Wherever I couldn't put a guard, I would do it myself. So I knew who he was talking about. Now his younger brother, I'm not going to give his name either. I'm going to call him Robert or Robbie. He had a pretty terrifying encounter. Me and you had discussed that. And I'm going to give the details about that encounter. But first, I wanted to get into what he told me. Now, at that point in time, the conversation just kind of ended. He says, hey, I got to get back to work, but I'll talk to you later. So he went back in and he started doing what he was doing. And I finished my sets and I went home. The next day, I was eager to see him again. So I came in a little bit early. He was finishing up when I got there. Now, the funny thing was, I pay attention to details. Him and his uncle, they would always leave before dark. Now, a lot of these workers, these contractors, the drywallers, whatever, they'll stay and they'll work past dark. But he was always packed up and ready to go by dark. So I got there early and I started shooting the breeze with him. And I mentioned that to him. I said, hey, you about to leave? And he said, yeah, I'm about to take off. And I said, why do you always leave before dark? And he kind of smiled and he goes, man, let me tell you, I don't stay any of these job sites after dark. He's like, we're out in the country right now. I just don't trust it. And so when I questioned him about it, I kind of lead it into it. I said, does this pertain to that thing that we were talking about? And he's like, yeah, I guess. I said, what happened to you? Do you mind telling me? And he kind of looked at me and he goes, man, you think I was crazy. And I said, look, I was listening to that show. I opened up to him and I said, look, I had an encounter myself with one of these things. And he's like, mentiroso, that means liar in Spanish. And I said, no. I said, for real. I said, I'll tell you what happened to me if you have a little bit of time. And he goes, yeah. So he went and sat down on the tailgate and we started bullcrapping. And one of his guys was with him and they were standing there. And he said, are you going to tell him about this thing that happened to you? And he goes, well, I'm going to hear his story first. So I said, all right. Started talking to him and I told him about my encounter. Looked him dead in his eye and told him everything that had happened to me. And I told him that I had heard a lot of stories over the years from people who have had similar encounters with these things. Now, it's interesting when I talked to his people, when they talked about their encounters, they never called it a wolf man or a werewolf. They always just said these things or these creatures. They didn't really have a name for it, which makes sense why he didn't know what the heck a dog man was. Because I guess not everybody is as interested as we are in finding the truth about what these things are. They're just like, hey, they're on our property. That's just the reality they deal with. But apparently a lot of people in that area have seen these things. They know what they are. A little sidelight before I go any further. Years ago, I used to go out with a girl. Her family was from Blanco. Her mother lived in Blanco. And I remember they lived out on the edge of town. And we went out there a couple times. It was nice. It was like fall. We were out on the porch in the backyard. And right before dark, they just got up and everybody went inside. And I was like, that's kind of odd. And I remember asking her mother, is there a reason why everybody just packed up and went in? She goes, oh, we just don't hang out after dark outside. She's like, there's prowlers. And I'm like, prowlers? I know country folk had always spoke of these supposed prowlers. I've heard all these stories about people that just prowled around, and I thought that was kind of a flimsy excuse. I didn't ask for any explanations. I wasn't going to press her mother and be like, tell me the real reason. But looking back on that, I always thought that was odd. So anyways, I don't know if that has anything to do with this, but it's in the same region. So I'm thinking, who knows? Maybe there is something to this. I know I've heard a lot of stories in that region about ghosts and a lot of different activity. There's a place called Devil's Backbone. It's been on Unsolved Mysteries. Basically, a lot of people talking about their encounters with spirits. So I know that the region is considered haunted, but I had never heard anybody talk about dogman activity. And of course, to us here in Texas, I think dogman is probably only about a 10-year-old term. It's not really something that people have ever called these things. I know in my hometown, we don't call them dogman. Anyways, let me get back to this. His encounter was pretty basic. It wasn't real terrifying. There wasn't a lot of drama involved, but it gave him proof that what his uncles and his grandfather and his dad had been saying over the years was legit. It was real. And so what happened was, he said it was the day before Christmas Eve. So I guess this would have been December 23rd. He told me the year too. He said it was 2006. And he said that his little kids were decorating the Christmas tree with some pine cones or something. And his youngest daughter at that time, he said she was like 4 or 5. I can't remember which. And he said his little boy was like 8 or 9. I think he said he was 8. I don't remember the ages exactly. Anyways, he said that the little girl and the little boy were looking out the window, and the little boy says, look, Daddy, a bunny. And he thought, oh, that's odd, a bunny, middle of winter, that's not normal. So he went outside and he looked and he thought maybe there was like a bunny rabbit that had come out of its burrow or something. So anyway, he came outside to look and he looked down and he didn't see anything, and the little girl started crying. He didn't know why she was crying, and to this day, he still says he doesn't really know if it was what she was looking at made her cry, or if it was his expression. You know how little kids will follow the parent and the parent will make an expression and the child will cry or whatever. But he said she started bawling. And so he picked her up, and when he picked her up and he got her right there in his arms, he looked straight ahead. That's when he saw this thing that was halfway behind the tree, and it had his arm around the tree, that it came out from behind the tree. And he said, I saw it clear as day. And he said this tree was about 60 yards from the house, and it was just standing there looking right at him. When I asked him, how big do you estimate this thing to have been? His exact words to me, he said it was probably about 7 feet tall. And he said it had reddish brown fur and an elongated snout and pointy ears. And he said he didn't remember the hands or the feet. He just remembers looking at the creature from a distance, and he saw that. He said that he called his wife, and he was like, honey, can you come take the kid or whatever? And she was like, I'm busy, because she was making tamales. And he said, can you come take the kid? Come here now. And so she came out to the living room. He gave her the child, and he's like, I need to go get my gun. And she's like, why? And he pointed to the window. And the little boy, I guess, was still kind of excited. He thought it was like some kind of big bunny, because he said it had really tall ears, which was weird. Like, I don't remember him going into detail about the ears, but he did tell me that it had big ears. I was in my mind thinking like Wile E. Coyote, you know, like the big ears. And I was thinking, I wonder how big these ears were that the little kid would think that it looked like a bunny. But anyway, I should have asked more details, but I didn't. I didn't want to interrupt him. He was telling the story. And he went inside, grabbed his .30-06 and went back out and was going to take a shot at it. He goes out onto the porch and it's gone. Now here's the question I asked him. I said, Jerry, you have your kids and your wife there. You weren't worried about going out on the porch, this thing maybe becoming aggressive and attacking? And he said, no, I always felt pretty secure around my property. He's like, but the funny thing was I have 4 big dogs and none of them were anywhere to be found. And he said at that point, I'd had to go check the property and just make sure this thing wasn't lurking around because I was worried. And so I said, where were the dogs? He says, well, I don't know. At that point, he didn't see the dogs and they weren't barking, which is weird. So he goes around, he checks the front of the property, he walks around the back of the property. Once he gets around the back of the property, the dogs were all in the backyard by one corner of the house on the opposite end from where he was at. So the dogs all kind of ran up to him and were like all close to him. Now I thought, maybe it's because he has like small wimpy dogs or something. He said he had big dogs, but not all big dogs are tough. I mean, like a lab is not a really vicious dog. So what kind of dogs did you have? Now he told me he had 2 German Shepherds, a pit bull mix. Yeah, and I'm thinking they're all big dogs. They're all pretty tough dogs. He said I had a pretty tough mutt. He was just mixed up. He said, but all 4 of them were pretty rough trade. And so I'm thinking, why were they not barking? That's weird. I don't even know why they would not be growling or barking if something's that close to the house. He couldn't figure it out either, and his wife was frantic to make him come back inside. And as he told me growing up over the years, he had heard stories about these things, but he had never seen one before. Now, that was his sole encounter because he did tell me that was the only thing that he had ever seen was that one particular creature. And I told him, I said, wow, that's a crazy story. And he said, but he goes, my family has seen these things. He goes, I grew up hearing stories about these things. And he goes, and until my brother had his encounter, I always just kind of thought it was just stories they told us to scare us, to keep us safe, come inside when it's dark. But, most country people, they're not afraid of the dark and they don't go inside when it's dark. They're not worried about the boogeyman. They live out in the country. They're used to seeing bobcats, coyotes, coy wolves, whatever. I mean, just me on post, I've seen bobcats and I've seen coyotes and all kinds of manner of animals, big old bucks. They'll come right through wherever you're working. If you're out there in the edge of the woods, Austin is surrounded by woods and we have a lake. Well, it's the lower Colorado River and it crisscrosses all over this area. It's so wide, they call it Lake Austin, Town Lake, and then Lake Travis, but it's really just the lower Colorado River in different areas. So anyways, he was saying he never thought anything of it. But after that, after he actually saw one and knew 100% that it was real, he was like, dude, he had already started to kind of believe, but he said that when his brother had his encounter, that's when he knew this was real. That one time he saw something, that was the nail in the coffin. And now what he told me was his brother had had an encounter and that I should ask his brother about his encounter because it was a lot more terrifying than what had happened to him. This time he said, if you count what happened with my brother, he's like, I guess I've seen it twice, but I don't really want to say it because it was so dark that I didn't really get a good look at it. But his brother did. So what I did was when I worked the other site, I purposely went to work the other site one day. And I went in early at that site. I switched with the guard so I could talk to his brother because his brother was the lead foreman over at the other site. And so I went over there and I talked to him, and they were installing the cabinets or whatever, like they always do. And I had talked to his brother on a few occasions, not as many times as I talked to Jerry, but I had met his brother before, and I had worked that site on occasion, but it wasn't a regular thing. So I kind of pinned him down. I said, "Hey, man, you got a minute?" And he said, "Yeah, dude, I'm getting ready to leave." And they were packing up their stuff. And same thing as I did with Jerry. I said, "Hey, I was just curious. I had talked to your brother about this dogman encounter you had." And he kind of looked at me and I said, "Dogman, I know that you probably don't know that term. It's what people call these things that you guys were seeing on the property." And he kind of shook his head. He said, "Oh, gotcha. Okay." And I said, "Can you tell me what happened with your encounter?" And he was like, "Sure, but I can't do it today. I'm in a hurry." So I made it a point to go back, that same site, go in early, whatever. So the next time I saw him, he actually had a friend with him the next day. And I guess this guy was a guy that worked with him off and on or whatever. And he was also a neighbor who actually, that neighbor, his name is Shane. That's what I'm going to call him. It was actually his family's property. And I guess Jerry and his brother Robbie's grandfather actually worked on that property for Shane's great-grandfather, if you're following me. And I guess that it was all Shane's great-grandfather's property at one time. And they actually bought, I guess his grandfather he was a vaquero. He was a cowboy. He worked for them. They had a bunch of cattle out there. And he was like the lead guy for them for a long time. And I guess when they decided to partition the land off and sell it, he bought a tract of that land. His land lies to the south, kind of the southwest from what they described to me, of Shane's property. Now, Shane is the guy that was there that day with him. And he said, "This is Shane. He's our neighbor, our nearest neighbor. And he's got 147 acres of land where he lives." And then their uncle, which would be, trying to not get you confused here, would be Robbie and Jerry, the guy that told me his encounter. Their uncle Abel and their uncle Noah have tracts of land that were passed down from their grandfather. And their dad's name is Andrew. Okay. So there were 4 brothers. There was Andrew, Noah, Abel, and then the other guy they called Jojo. He's the youngest, Joseph. Now he had an encounter too that I'm going to get into, but it wasn't on the ranch. He doesn't live out on the ranch. He lives in Buda. Okay. And a little backstory to him. He was kind of the black sheep of the family. He always kind of made fun of these guys. Like, "Oh yeah, you're seeing these kokoi," and kind of joked about it and thought it was cute and funny to tease them. And he had told them, "Yeah, if I ever see one of these things, I'm going to knock it out. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that." And they were just like, "Yeah, right." Well, anyways, he worked directly with Jerry over at the first site that I was telling you about. Now, I would see him regularly. And that night, Jerry and his uncle, they showed up over there at the property where I had gone in to work early the second time. And they were all there. They all showed up and they were standing around having a beer, because a lot of times these contractors will do that. And usually I don't allow that, but they're pretty good guys. And we had agreed they were going to tell me the stories. So I had them all there together, and Robbie told me his story. I keep trying to make sure I say that name and not his real name. His story was really scary. What happened to him, and this guy, when he was telling me this story, he looked me right in my eye. I could tell this guy wasn't lying. I mean, I guess it is possible that these guys all got together and conspired to lie to me, maybe thinking I was gullible or something, but I don't believe that. They were very sincere about it, and they were very open and honest about it. And Robbie told me that when he was 17 years old, that he was out on his 4-wheeler riding around on the property. His mother was always very adamant about him coming home on time, and he said that she would always use the excuse of coming home for dinner to get him to come home before dark. And he was the youngest. He was the youngest of Andrew's sons, okay? And that, like I said, is the 4 brothers, and their dad was the one that bought the property. So Jerry and Robbie, and then their brother, Andre, they are all the sons of Andrew. And now Andrew would be the youngest son, or the second to youngest son of those 4 brothers I was telling you about. And those are all the neighbors of Shane. Okay? So if you follow that, okay, I hope everybody can follow that. Okay, so anyways, that's the back, just to let you know. And this property is pretty big. It's well over 1,000 acres of altogether. It's pretty big. So anyways, what these guys were telling me was that each one of them had something like some sort of encounter. So we'll start with Robbie's encounter. He was out on his ATV. He rode out to a stand that they had that they would use to hunt hogs. And in Texas, everybody knows Texas, there's hogs everywhere. We have a problem with hogs. Most counties offer bounties on hogs. If you bring them a tail, like I was telling you, Vic, me and a buddy of mine were in Lockhart, and he was shooting them off of his back porch out on the edge of town. Well, out in the country, but it's still like it's not far out of town. And that's because there's so many. They're just everywhere. They're causing a lot of problems. They're a nuisance animal. So anyways, he was telling me this story, and he said that he was in the stand hunting hogs, and his mother called. And he told her, look, I'm out here in the stand. I'm trying to kill something. He was learning how to bow hunt. So he had his bow with him. Now, he did say he had a pistol, too. So he told me, he said, I'm sitting there with my bow. For the first time, he's like, I really told my mom, look, I'll be home when I'm ready. And she got upset, and he hung up. So he sat there for a couple more hours, and right before it got dark, he said that the sun was already starting to go down in the back, the backdrop, because he was facing the west. He said that there's a lot of trees. It's kind of like a hollow. There's a lot of trees there, and there's like a little clearing. And he said that he saw something, the bushes start to move, and he saw something. He thought that, first he said he thought it dropped down out of a tree. And then he thought, well, that can't be right. But then he said that it was kind of creeping around behind some bushes. And he thought he saw the silhouette of this thing stand up. And then he thought, maybe my eyes are playing tricks on me. But then it was on all fours again. And he thought, is this a bear? And then he thought, no way, there's no bears out here, And so he had some binoculars. He said, so he lifted up the binoculars and he looked, and he said he saw like what looked like an ear, like a canine ear. That's the first thing he told me. What his exact words were, a wolf's ear, but I'm assuming canine, whatever. And so he said it looked like a wolf. And he said that it went through his mind that it could be something, but then he thought there's coy wolves. Maybe that's what it is. At that time, people didn't know what a coy wolf was. These really large coyotes that look like wolves, but now we know that they're coy wolves. They're a hybrid that have reached all the way down here to Texas. So anyway, he thought, I'm going to take a shot at this thing, but it never would come out into the clearing. So he's like, me being stupid and young, I whistled at it to see if it would respond and come out into the clearing so I could take a shot at it. And he said when he did this thing, it came out into the clearing, but it stood up on two legs. And he said literally when this thing stood out in front of him, and I asked him, I said, what was the distance from you to that thing? He said it was probably, at first he said that it was about 100 yards. That's what he said at first. And then I said 100 yards. It was that far. And then he started estimating and he said, no, it couldn't have been about 100. It could have been about 75 yards. So I'm going to assume that it was probably a pretty good distance at that point, that he had to look at it with binoculars. Maybe that's somewhere between 75 and 100 yards. That's the best distance that he could come up with, best I could come up with. And I asked him, I said, well, you've been out to that spot before, right? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, you've been out there since? And he said, no. He had never gone back out there to relive that and to see, where that, he said, I never even go to that part of the property ever. Now, this place where he was at was in the middle property. Like I said, their property is on the furthest south end of this whole tract of what used to be the Hitchens Ranch. Now, Hitchens is not their real last name. That's why but that's Shane's property. Now, that was his great-grandfather had bought that land and cleared it out, and they used it to raise cattle and sheep. Well, sheep on one side, cattle on the other. So what he told me was, it was on Noah's property. Now, Noah's property, the way it's laid out, the way they described it to me was Andrew, their dad, he had the further south property, and then there was Noah's property in the middle, and then further north and a little bit to the west was Abel's property, and then a little further west and to the north was Shane's property. Okay. Now, that's how the land was laid out. So he was technically on what was Noah's property. That was his uncle. And Noah was the oldest brother. I believe he was the oldest brother. So anyway, he was on Noah's property, and he's like, I've never been back to that part of the property ever again. I never went back. He's like, I didn't go and judge the distance. So we kind of came up with a number, maybe 7,500 yards. So this thing, he said it just started to walk toward him, and he said it was so big that the sun going down in the back behind the trees, you could still see it kind of breaking through the trees. He said it blocked out the sun. And I was like, wow, that's a big creature, from where it was standing. He goes, there's no, I can't even tell you how much it weighed. It was huge. It was just gigantic. And he said that from what he saw, it was a reddish brown color. Once again, that same color. And that it was coming toward him, just walking like a man, And I said, did it kind of lurch hunched over, or was it walking straight? He said, no, just like a man would walk, swinging its arms sideways. He said the arms were long, and he said that his body was built like a bodybuilder, but it had a huge, gigantic wolf head on it. And I said, what about the legs? He's like, I didn't really notice the legs at that time. He goes, it was just coming straight at me. I didn't see, I said, well, a lot of people report that they're backward bent legs, and he said he didn't notice that. So anyway, he's getting ready to leave, and then he's thinking, I don't know if I should try to get to my ATV and take off, and then this thing's going to follow me, or should I wait till it gets closer and try to kill it? All these things are going through his mind. And when he's telling me this story, you could tell that he was reliving this account. And I asked him a couple times if he needed to stop. I said, you need to stop or whatever, and he's like, no, I'm good. And everybody was very quiet and respectful, which, these guys are always joking around and they're always messing with each other. And I knew that they were taking it seriously too. I was watching their reactions because I wanted to make sure these guys weren't pulling my leg. So he's sitting there, he's reliving this, and I could tell that it was bothering him. And so anyway, this thing's coming toward him, and he said just then he hears a hog, like a hog snorting, and he could hear little babies like piglets. And he said at that point he had started praying. And in his mind, he says he thinks it was like a miracle, like God delivered him. I mean, like he goes, I'm not kidding, Wolf. He goes, I think that God delivered me. That was his words. I mean, he believes that, and that's fine. I respect that. I don't know what I believe about that or not, but could be just a coincidence. But anyway, a sow with little piglets came out, and he said that thing, it just kneeled down. It got down on all fours like so fast, boom, and then it just kind of like started sauntering toward the edge of the clearing. And he said that at that point he thought that thing was waiting for the sow to come out to ambush it, and so he was like, you know what, this is my chance. And he said that the shed where he was sitting was like a tin shed, so that he was going to have to open the door, and he said that the thing was going to make noise. So he started to open it, and it was like, I can't do the sound effect, but he said it made a scraping noise, and he was like, oh, no, it's going to hear that, and he said that it did. It turned its head and kind of cocked its head and kind of turned it sideways, and he said that it was like sniffing the air. And he said, oh, man, this thing is it's either going to go for me or it's going to go for those hogs. And he said at that point, it sounded like the hogs were moving away. So he thought, these hogs probably got wind of it or something, and they're booking the other direction, and it's not following them. So he just made a break for his four-wheeler, and he took off. And he started it up, and he hauled butt out of there. Now, he said that there's a short trail to get back to the main road, which leads to Noah's house. Now, he was going to try and make a break for his uncle's house. Now, he said that his uncle's house was probably about a 5-minute ride. It wouldn't be that far, but he would have to cut to get there that quickly. He was going to have to cut through a pasture. And he said that there was just a cattle guard right there that goes into that particular pasture, so he could just make a break right for it. Well, the problem was that there was this Broford bull, okay, and if you know anything about bulls, Brofords are like the meanest. What it is a heifer cow or bull that's been bred with a Brahma. And they're notoriously mean-spirited animals. They're not friendly at all. And they have a really, really nasty disposition. So anyway, he's like, I was going to have to contend with that bull. And he said, never fails. You go into that pasture, and the bull's name was Simon. That's what they told me. And he said, when you go into that pasture, Simon's he automatically just comes and he defends his territory. Now, what they told me was that bull was so mean that it had killed a younger, smaller bull. It had actually sired. So it killed its own offspring. So this thing was a vicious animal, and he wasn't kind to people going into his area, his territory. And so they had told me before that they had had cattle that had been killed. That, it was a regular occurrence, and it was to the point where Shane was about to just quit messing with them. He said the only kind of cattle he could keep out there, this is what Shane had told me, was longhorns, because they were so mean and had big old horns that for whatever reason, these creatures wouldn't really mess with them. Well, if you had anything else, like any kind of cows of any kind of other hornless anything, they were going to attack it. So they had drove him out of the cattle business altogether. But this Broford bull, obviously, they had respect for it. It had never been messed with because it was so big. It was about 1,800 pounds, according to what they were telling me. And he said this thing could run, too. It was fast. which is crazy. You know, you think about a giant animal moving that fast. Well, this thing made a beeline for him, and I see that thing coming out onto the main road, and it's following me. He's like, it is behind me. You know, and he goes, and when I crossed over the cattle guard and I hugged the, you know, I just went and I went straight to the fence line as far away as I could from Simon. And Simon was on the clear on the other side of the pasture. He came running over there to, you know, to see what was up, you know, who's in my enclosure. And he just said, I'm going to try and make it as fast as I can to the back fence. Well, he said the problem was that there were all these divots and holes in that ground where he was riding. And so he said that he was jumping and bouncing and he couldn't really go super fast. He said he was catching air a couple times and coming down on the front, and he thought he was going to flip at one point. And he's like, something's going to get me. It's either going to be the bull or it's going to be that thing. And he's going over in his mind, like, which way do I want to die? Do I want to be gored to death or do I want to be eaten? So this is going on in this kid's head. He's 17 years old. You know, it's got to be a traumatizing experience. So he said he's trying to go as fast as he can, but he's still trying to control this ATV. And when he gets to a certain point, he sees that the bull is going to meet him at some point. And he said his only chance was to get off of that ATV and try to hop over a barbed wire fence that was reinforced with an electrical fence. So he was going to get messed up. So he was like, I can try to open the gate, but I'd have to undo it and all that. And he said that there was no way that he was going to be able to get through that. So he decided to just jump off the ATV. He said it was like he had slowed down as much as he could. He just kind of jumped and hopped up a tree. He climbed up a tree. He said there was like a mid-sized oak tree, and he climbed up it, and no sooner he got halfway up, that bull was right at the base of it. So he goes, I'm looking down, and I got this bull at the base of this tree, and he goes, I don't know what to do. And he said, and I looked off in the distance, and he goes, and I could see that thing, the way he described it, which was the dog man. And he said that it had flattened itself onto the ground, and it was like you could see its back, and you could kind of see the top of the head or whatever. And he said that it was laying down, hiding in the grass at the front of the pasture. So this thing was not going to contend with that bull. I guess it just wasn't going to do it. And he said that it just sat there. And he said this thing was big, really big. So that bull must have been really nasty for that thing to not try to even, you know, whatever. He said that it just sat there. And he said that he sat there up in that tree, and he was like, where's my phone? He pulled his phone out, and his phone was dead. So there was no calling for help. There was no nothing, you know, and he was like, I don't know what I could do. There's nothing I could do, you know. I was just stuck. I'm just sitting in this tree. And he goes, and I had told my mom basically to pound salt. So he goes, I figured nobody was coming to look for me because, you know, they were just going to let me do what I wanted. And he said, I kept regretting telling her, you know, she goes, I should have just left when she called me. He kept telling me that. So anyways, he's sitting up in this tree, and he says finally it gets dark. The bull's still at the base of the tree, and that thing is still crouched down, sitting there just waiting for him. And so he figured, if this bull gets tired and moves away from the tree, then I can get out of here. I can jump the fence maybe, and then that thing's probably going to come after me. And he's like, can I make it to the house? These things are going through his head. So finally, at this point, he goes, I saw some headlights coming down the road. And that's when his brother kind of jumped in. And Jerry tells me, he goes, yeah, my mom had come and got us, and we were working on my brother's truck. And they told us to go find your little brother because it's past dark and he hadn't come in yet. And so they were worried about him. And so anyways, they were kind of aggravated by that because they were like, this little turd, you know, he didn't listen, and now we got to go get him and stop what we're doing. So they went out there to go fetch him or whatever. But the dad wasn't there, I guess. And from what they said, their dad was in town. He was with their little sister or whatever getting groceries, and their truck was not running. So they had to walk over to Noah's property. And when they got to the house, they told Noah what happened. They got in his old truck. They went down the dirt road, and they had a big spotlight looking for him. They looked everywhere. They went into the hollow. They didn't see him. They went all over the property. They went into Abel's property, and finally they came back down the opposite way, and that's when they saw Robbie was yelling at him, and they shined the light, and they saw the ATV sitting there. At this point, it had ran out of gas. He didn't even turn it off. He said it just ran out of gas. And that's when they pulled into the pasture. Robbie tells me they should have seen this thing there on the corner of the pasture, crouched down in the grass. He goes, but they drove right by it and they didn't see it. And none of them said that they saw it. So this thing was hiding pretty well. Robbie knew it was there, and he was yelling at him. So this thing is right there. You know, they drive right by it, literally. And he's waving at them. There's something there, you know. And when they pulled up, now this bull, usually there's always at least one person that can handle him. Noah had raised this bull since he was a baby, since it was a calf. So Noah told him, stay in the truck. He got out and he got the bull to back off, and he walked it off to the other side of the pasture. And I guess he did something. I don't know. He put it somewhere. They didn't elaborate on that. But anyway, the first guy out of the truck was his oldest brother, Andre. He gets out of the truck and he's like, come on, dude, get down. And Robbie says, there's a thing sitting there in the corner of the pasture. It chased me into this enclosure. Because they were asking him, why are you in this enclosure? You know, and he's like, this thing is right there. And they're like, what thing? We don't see anything. So they start shining the flashlight, you know, in that area where he's claiming that he's seeing something. And Jerry said, he goes, I was just standing there. I didn't know what to think one way or the other. But he goes, Andre decided to be, because he's always kind of like a bully. The way they described him, he's kind of a bully. So he was like, oh, whatever, dude. It's the Kukui. He's out there in the yeah, right. Okay, whatever. And he said, it's right there. And so when he gets down, he points at it and he shines the light right on it. And he goes, that's a dirt mound. And so he goes, it's a dirt mound. He starts walking toward it. And he goes, let me prove it to you. He goes, there's nothing there. So Robbie and and Jerry are looking at each other. You know, he's like, we looked at each other and kind of shrugged our shoulders like, go ahead, whatever. You're going to walk right up on it. And they're telling him, at this point, Jerry's even telling him, hey, man, come on, dude. You don't know what that is. Because, you know, like I said, he had seen one. So who knows, dude? This thing is there, you know. So anyways, this part was really crazy. Andre gets right up to the thing, about 15 yards away from it. He turns around. He goes, I don't see. This thing stands up behind him. Okay, and they're screaming, hey! And then at that point, his uncle saw it too and was like yelling at him. He's like, hey, Vavoso, you know, look behind you. And that thing is like turned around, basically one leap, went over the fence and was just not running. They said it just kind of got to the road and just kind of sauntered into the woods. And Andre turned around and saw it right when it jumped over the fence. And he said it just was one leap, boom, and it was over the fence. And this fence is not, it's about chest high. So this thing just jumped right over it and was like over, you know, the other side of the road, you know. And he said that Andre like tripped backwards. Literally, he tried to run and he tripped and fell backwards and like monkey rolled, dropped the flashlight, left it, whatever, and ran back to the truck. And they all scrambled to try to get into the cab, you know. And they were telling Robbie, get in the back. And he was like, no. And they were like fighting and arguing. And Noah tells him, you know, shut up, let's get out of here. And so they drove out through the other pasture. They went through the back way and they drove through the bumpy pastures to get back to Noah's main house. And when they got back to the house, he said we were all just in shock. Now, Jerry said from where he was standing, the angle that he had, he said, I didn't get a good look at it. He goes, I saw something stand up and it was dark, but Andre was kind of in front of it and I was on the other side of the truck. He's like, so I didn't really get a good view. I thought I saw something go across the road. Now, Noah saw it clearly from where he was at, and I guess Robbie, you know, of course he saw it, and Andre turned around and saw it jump over the fence. So I guess that would be considered Jerry's like second encounter or whatever. But like he said, you know, he didn't get a real good look at it, but he knew what it was, and they were all freaked out because it was interesting that the same color that the one that Jerry saw was what Robbie reported to me, was that it was a reddish brown color. Now I'm thinking, same creature? I don't know. But anyways, I was hoping that Jerry would have been able to elaborate if he thinks that was the same one, because the one he saw was the same color. But, you know, like I said, he said he didn't get a good look at it. So anyway, that was Robbie's encounter. Robbie said he never had another encounter beyond that, but I'm sure that's enough for anybody. I don't think he's going to want to have another. And he said he wasn't going back out to Noah's property for nothing. So that was the end of that. So anyways, the other encounter that I was going to talk about, now this was their neighbor Shane. Now Shane is there and he's a real country dude. So I'm going to try to use my own words to describe what happened to him. Now his encounter involved him being on horseback. Now that was really interesting to me And I said, now what happened to you? And that's when I just kind of went around the horn and I said, hey, can you tell me? And he's like, well, what happened to me? He's like, first of all, he said, these things have been on my property for a long time. So he had heard stories about them, from all the way back to his grandfather and his great aunt had an encounter. And he said, now this is what happened to me. Now he claims that he was on, like I said, this is their stories, not mine. I'm not, if you think these are lies, it's, this is what they told me. Okay. I can't testify to the veracity of this because I was not a witness to any of these events. All right. So don't shoot the messenger, but this is what he said. Now, this story is really crazy. Like, he said that he was on horseback one day with his wife, and the horse that she was on began to rear and kind of buck a little bit, and it was like they were on this trail. Now, the trail they were on is like literally the boundary between Abel's property and his. Now, like I said, Abel's property is the furthest north of the brothers, of the Hernandez family brother. Not their real name, but anyways. What Shane told me was that her horse kind of started to rear, and he said, we have several horses, and he said that had never happened before, and he thought a snake, so he looked down, he didn't see anything, and the horse just wouldn't go any further, and it started getting real ornery, so he said, you know what, let's just go back in, so they took the horses back in, and they put them back in the corral, whatever, and they put them back up in the barn, and he said that was just unusual, that had never happened before. So he said he thought that there might have been something there. Now, he said a few days after that, he went out for a trot around the property on his horse, the same one he had that same day, that didn't react the way the other horse had. Now, he said this was a really seasoned mare. He'd been on this horse a lot, and he was out for a trot with that horse and checking his property. He said he got around to that same spot in the trail, and his horse started to act kind of funny and whatever, and he was like, whoa, and he thought, man, this is crazy, this is the same spot where I was at last time. Now, he said at this point, he heard something. He heard like footfall, twigs snapping and breaking, and the tree line that was right there, there's like a ditch. He said there was like a ditch right there, and there was a tree line. He heard twigs and things snapping and breaking, and he thought, what the heck is that? And he looks down, and he sees this thing, what he thought was a giant wolf, walking along the tree line or whatever, and he thought, man, that is weird. What is that? And it's paralleling him and the horse. At this point, the horse wanted nothing to do with it. It wanted to head back to the stable, obviously. So it bucked. He stayed on it, and it bucked, and it threw him off. And he said after a couple of those, it just threw him off, and it was gone. And he said it took off the other side down there's a little embankment, he said there, and then it goes up a little bit, and then there's like the barbed wire fence to Abel's property. And he said that it just jumped onto that fence to try to get over the fence to get back toward the stables. And he said it jumped over the fence and got hung up. And he said at that point, when a horse runs away, they usually run in the direction of where they stable. But this thing was, like his first reaction was just trying to go back to the stables. No, this thing was just trying to get away because it was going toward Abel's property, not the other direction, which is where they live. Which it would have had to go down and around this tree line. So this thing was panic. It was just sheer panic, So anyway, whatever it was had scared the living crud out of this horse. It had jumped and it caught its leg on the barbed wire. This thing came bounding out of the tree line. Now, like I told you on the pre-interview, Vic, that's not the words he used. He used another word. It was like, I don't know. But anyways, it came in my words, not his. It bounded out onto the road. He said it just kind of sat there like a football player, just staring at him like it was going to form tackle him. And he said he was laying on the ground and he thought maybe he had hurt his tailbone. He felt like it had broken something. He did have a pistol. Now, he said he had a big old .357 pistol, and he said that he pulled it out and he was getting ready to take a shot at this thing, and it went toward the horse. And he said he kind of paused for a second, and then he unloaded several rounds. He stood up, and he was still kind of in shock, and he was walking backwards. And he said that from what he saw, the thing had stopped. The horse had gotten loose and was running across the pasture into Abel's property. And he said that this thing stopped when he fired the shots. Now, he don't know if he hit it or not, but he said he fired several rounds, and it all happened so fast it was like a blur, in his words. And he said that he leveled the gun at it, and when he did, it crouched down and was snarling and growling and snapping, but it didn't lunge at him. And he said his boot was halfway off and he was trying to get his foot in his boot. Now, when he was telling me this story, he was very animated and he was giving me all these physical gestures and I could get into what he was saying. You know what I mean? At one point, he even kind of was like on the ground, like showing me, you know. So anyway, this guy's giving me this real descriptive physical description of what was going on. I wish I could relay it the way he was telling me, but I'm doing the best I can. And he said that he was trying to get his boot on, you know, and he said that, you know, his arm was all skinned up and he had rocks in his arm, whatever. And he leveled his gun at this thing again to try to, because it was creeping toward him. And he said that it would start to stand up. He would point the gun at it and it would get back down. So that tells me that this thing is cognizant of what that gun is, what it's capable of, what it does. It knew that this thing produces pain, you know? So anyway, his words were, this knew what a gun was, you know, it knew what my pistol was. And so he's like, I'm backing up. And finally I just take off running. And he said that he looked back and the thing didn't follow him. Like it didn't come bounding down the road at him. He said it didn't follow him at all. And he ran and he said that the closest to property that he was Abel's house. So he ran over to Abel's house and was like banging on the door like, hey, you know, and he said that they took him to the hospital. He had a hairline fracture in his lower back, a couple vertebrae, whatever. I think he said he broke a couple toes and his arm was all tore up. But he said when the horse got back to the stable, it made its way back to the house. Horses are smart. They know where to go. But his wife said that the back leg was all tore up. Poor thing was just, it had ripped the leg up pretty bad. Apparently, though, she recovered. Now, here's what's really interesting. He said he didn't see this thing attack the horse. But like he said, it happened so fast, it was like a blur. But there was a really long gash on the right flank of the horse, which would have been the opposite of the way that the horse was facing him from what he was telling me. He don't know how that got there. He said unless this thing was just lightning fast enough to like take a swipe at it and he didn't see it, and then it got back onto the road when he started firing. Because when he said he started shooting, it was just, that was it. It just, you know, that thing was focused on him. So anyways, this incident he told me about, and I asked him, I said, were there any other incidents involving you? Did anything else happen? He said, no. He said, now my little brother Cody, he has about 10 acres that are basically on the Hitchens property. The way they described Cody, and I ain't met the kid, that's the youngest brother, and he's got another brother that lives in Giddings. But the way that it was described to me by the Hernandez brothers and by Shane was that he's kind of a hardhead and that he apparently has seen these things 3 different times. But one time with his wife, they went out to check because the chickens had been getting harassed and they heard all this noise, and that he saw one. This is the only story that they relayed to me that was about Cody, the younger brother of Shane. And like I said, he lives in a little bottom right there that's literally on Shane's property. You know, he just kind of gave him a spot or whatever. So anyway, he said that his little brother had gone out there, and he said the way they've described him is he's kind of a hardhead. So he goes out there and he said that this thing was sitting there by the chicken coop, chowing down on chickens and eggs, and it lifted up its head and it had egg yolk on its face. So it was eating eggs, and I guess it had killed all the chickens. And so he was just infuriated. So Cody, instead of being afraid, like most people would be like, holy crap, you know, his wife freaks out and she runs back to the house. He runs back in there and he's like, I'm going to kill this. So he goes in there and he grabs his 22-250 or whatever and runs. Well, that's, you know, a deer rifle. They said a deer rifle. I'm assuming that's what it was. I don't know. But anyway, he runs back out, you know, and he's going to shoot it. At that point, I told Shane, I said, is this kid crazy? Is he got a mental problem? And they're all kind of like, yeah, he's kind of stupid. And I'm just like, that is insane. Like, I would not go back out and try to shoot something that's just right. You know, it had just, you know, slaughtered your animals. I understand. And he's angry. But after what these things had reportedly done to these other guys, and I asked him if Cody gave him a description of it. And he said from what he was told, and he had told him and Jerry, both of them, that its fur was gray. And he remembers that he said it looked just like a timber wolf. That's weird. And he said, but it had these weird backward bent legs, and it was crouched down, and it had weird looking hands. That tells me, yeah, that's the telltale signs of a dog man, and that's probably what it was. But that the fur was a different color altogether, not the reddish brown color of the ones that they had encountered. This one was gray. So to me, there's definitely a population there In my mind, that's what I'm thinking. There's a population there. It's not just one critter that's running around terrorizing these people. It's more than one. Now, there's another story that was told to me when I pushed him a little further. I told Shane, I said, you said that there were some stories growing up that you had heard. He said, well, one of the funniest ones in particular was there was a door-to-door salesman that had come out onto the property to sell, I guess, tractor supplies or something. I guess back in the day, these people would go door to door and they would try to get these country folk to buy stuff. I don't know. Anyway, he said it was a salesman, and he said he came hauling up the gravel road to the house. Now, this happened on his Aunt Myrtle's property, which is now part of, I guess, the north part of the Hitchens property. That's where her place was. But that would be his grandfather's sister, from what he told me. And she had a husband that lived on the property. And apparently he wasn't a very nice guy. He was a drunk and he had beat her and he was pretty mean. And ultimately he disappeared. Apparently, like he went out one day and just never came back. And they don't know what happened to him. Now, who knows? I know that he had mentioned that his grandfather and them didn't like the guy. And then of course there was an investigation. They never found a body. Maybe the dogmen got him. I don't know the whole story, but I know that one time this salesman came up the road and he was honking the horn, and they come out and they're like, who is this guy? What do you want? You know, this is broad daylight. And the guy says, you know, I was going to try and sell you some supplies, but I just would like an escort off of your property. And he's like, what are you talking about? And he goes, when I drove through, I just saw something run across the road that looked like it weighed 800 pounds and it was hairy. Can you please just get me off this property? And so the dude was like, you know, they're looking at each other like, is this guy crazy? Well, the thing was, his Aunt Myrtle had told her husband that she had had a problem when she was younger, that she had seen these things. And apparently this uncle of theirs this guy she had married, he had seen them too, but he was like one of those people that was in denial about it. And he had all kinds of explanations about it, like people that have, you know, there'll be a haunting or something, and one person will be like, well, I saw this, and the other person's like, I just saw shadows. I don't know what that was. You know what I mean? So apparently, I guess from what I could deduce, that's what this guy was a real, just a diehard. He wasn't gonna, so and like I said, he drank and he hit her, so who knows what kind of person he was other than just a villain, I guess. So anyways, he told the guy, he's like, well, I ain't gonna do for you, you know, and she's like, oh, come on, Hank, or whatever, you know, whatever his name was, something like that. And she's like, just give him an escort out of here. So he got in his truck and followed him out, and they just thought that was crazy. So she told him, her husband, that they had stuff going on that property since she was a girl. Now, the one story that sticks out in the mind of Shane, what he told me was his Aunt Myrtle had told him that one day she was out chopping firewood with her brother being his grandfather. Now, he said that when she was out there chopping the firewood or whatever, that the brother just, I guess his grandfather, and this was a story that was relayed to him by his great aunt, that her brother, his grandfather, his name is Amos, grabbed her and said, let's go inside now. And she was like, why? What? And she said, don't look back, just let's go. He started pushing her, and she's like, stop pushing me. You know, she's getting upset. And he just yanks her and starts pulling her in. And she said this was back during the Depression, so I'm assuming like in the 30s. She looked back, she turned around, and just then her dog, their little dog, had run up and was confronting this creature, and it just opened its mouth. She said it had the biggest mouth that she had ever seen of any creature in any book, and it just reached down and grabbed the dog and just snapped, and all she heard was a crunching pop and a yelp, and then it was over. I guess the dog was covering their retreat, and it paid for it with its life. And he said that really had an effect on her. That when she told that story, she had tears in her eyes, and she was telling, she's like, that's why I don't want you youngins out there after dark. And that's why we don't go out after dark. So that was a very telling story for him. Obviously, Shayna had an effect on him. But like I said, he only had the one encounter. He'd never seen these things. They're pretty elusive, you know, and they were all pretty much in agreement that they're not around during certain times of the year. So I don't know if these things are seasonal. Maybe they hibernate during the summer. I'm trying to figure out that myself. But they said that most of the time, the encounters they had were in the fall, anytime in the late fall to early spring. And that's when they would see them. And throughout the winter, they would see them. So these things aren't hiding out in the winter. They're roaming around. And he said the cowboys that had worked for his grandfather when his spread got really big, The grandfather was the son of the guy that founded it, I guess, and that would be Shane's great-grandfather. And of course, Abel, Noah, and Andrew, their father, he worked for the great-grandfather or whatever. So anyways, I guess when he was a young man, he came to work for him. And I guess he was from Mexico originally, and he was a vaquero down in Mexico. So he took a job there, his first job he could get. And there were several other Mexicans that had come over because at that time they were telling me that there was something going on down there. There was some kind of war or something. So they all came up here to work, and they went to work for his great-grandfather. This stuff had been happening for a long time. And from what they were telling me, some of these vaqueros back in the day would see these things, roaming around the property, and they would take shots at them. And so I'm thinking they probably shot at them pretty regularly, and these things would just kind of run away because they knew what these things were capable of. So, that could have been either a learned trait that was passed down for these creatures to know what that gun was that Shane had. Because I thought that immediately when he said that they would take shots at him all the time, and that they had a bunkhouse. And now they told me that there was this old, it's run down now, but there was a bunkhouse where the vaqueros stayed at that was to the far west of the property. And that one night these things attacked the bunkhouse and that they were shooting at them. And they didn't go into detail. They didn't know a lot of details. They just heard this story passed down from the older generation. He also said that his grandfather at one time, he said that there was a big hole with like a tunnel that led down into the ground, kind of at an angle, and they covered it up. And he said that after they did that, it seemed like there was a spike in the activity, like a lot of sightings were taking place out there. And I'm sure that if I could ever talk to these older gentlemen, the uncles of these people, I could probably glean some really good information from them about this, but I don't have access to that, and I didn't ask. But anyway, those are the little side stories that I was told about this property and what had gone on there. And now the last encounter of this family, of the Hernandez family, was a brother. That's Jojo. Now, he's a real character. I like him. He's a good dude. I really like him a lot. He's funny. He was kind of the black sheep. He was the youngest of the four brothers. Abel, Noah, and Andre are his older brothers. Now, Jojo, he's kind of a joker, man. He likes to joke around. He's all tattooed up. Now, he did a stint in prison. He was in prison for a few years. He had gotten in trouble and did some time. So he liked to ride motorcycles. He didn't live out on the property. He moved and got married young and all this other stuff. But once he got out of the joint, in his words, he said, I cleaned up, I went back to God, and I went to work for my nephew, and I've been doing it ever since. Now, I've talked to him on several occasions, and I talked to him before I even knew that he was Jerry's uncle. So, anyway, he was working on the crew with Robbie over at the other property. So he was there that night. We were sitting there talking because we all kind of met that night, and I had bought them food. So I kind of was bribing them, tell me these stories. So anyway, we're sitting there and we're talking, and now this guy, Jojo, he goes, I have a story, but I don't want to talk about it. And I said, come on, man. And they all kind of started razzing him. They're like, oh, yeah, you're the guy that was going to knock it out and all this other stuff. And he's like, yeah, it happened. What happened, and he didn't want to tell me. And I said, come on, man. Everybody else has told me their story. I want to hear your encounter. And he said, well, mine didn't happen on the ranch. He's like, and I nearly died. And I'm going like, well, it sounded like Robbie nearly died too. It sounded like Shane nearly died. So what makes you different, And he's like, yeah, but man, mine was bad. It was really bad, dude. And I was just like, well, everybody's is the worst because it happened to them. You know what I mean? So we're sitting here talking, and he says, well, this happened to me at a property. Now I'm going to call this the Lowry place. Now these were people that lived in town, and they decided they were going to build a house out in the country. Apparently this guy was somebody that they knew from school, that they had gone to school with. They all knew. They played football together. Anyway, we're going to call it the Lowry place. I'm not going to give you the last name because I don't know these people at all. This is secondhand from somebody else. So anyways, they were installing the cabinets for them. They had built a big old house right there about 5 miles out of town. And he said it was literally about 2 or 3 miles up the road from Shane's place. So it's close to the same area. It's the same area. I doubt these things respect any boundaries. I'm sure that they probably roam around that whole region. I doubt that they're like, oh, this is somebody's property, I'm going to stay here. No, they move around. So it makes sense that this would happen. But anyways, he didn't believe any of the stories. He always thought it was just a bunch of mentiras, as he would say. So he said that, I never bought into that. I always thought it was a bunch of bull crap. He goes, but I was working late one night and my partner, my carnal, he had left, he was gone. And he said, I decided to stay late so I could try to finish up. I wanted to knock this job out. Plus, he said he wanted to do a good job. They were good friends, they were friends of mine. I wanted to do a good job, And so I'm staying back and I'm working late. He's like, I called my wife and I said, I'm going to be home late. I'm going to stay here and try to finish this job. Well, he said that it got to be his exact time frame was, he said that it was close to midnight. So he had been there pretty late. And he said that he thought at one point, he thought he had seen something move towards one of the back windows earlier, right after dusk. But he's like, my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then he said around midnight, he said he clearly saw something move by one of the windows near the kitchen where he was working. And he said, oh no, at that point, he goes, I knew I saw something. And so this thing was lurking around, And he said he turned the music off and he sat there for a minute just frozen like, what am I going to do? What the heck am I going to do? And he said all these thoughts were going through my mind like maybe this is what these people were talking about. And then he said maybe it's a Bigfoot. He said it was obviously on two legs. So he didn't know what it was, but he knows he saw it. But he didn't get a good look at it because the lights were on the inside and it was pitch dark outside. So he says he walked to the front door and he locked it just because his instinct just to lock the door. And then he said just then he heard something walk up onto the step right there in front of the front door. And at this point, he's like, whoa, am I imagining this? Is this really happening? I know how that feeling is, having had my own encounter. You're thinking that at first, like, what is this? When he was telling me, it was the same thing when Robert was telling me his story. It was like, it was an emotional ride for him. You know what I mean? I could see it and everybody was quiet and we were listening. When everybody would tell their side of whatever happened, everybody was trying to be respectful. There wasn't anybody joking around and playing around, and that's what I'm saying. These guys always do that. They like to razz people. But they weren't joking. There was no chuckle house here. This guy was telling his story, and he said that something was at the door, and he looked out the peephole, and he goes, and I turned the porch light on. He's like, I didn't see anything. I just saw black. And he said that that's not correct, because with the porch light on, he should have been able to see his truck. He said his truck wasn't but like 10, 12 yards from the house where he was parked right there, So anyways, he says he sees nothing but black, and he says then that he hears something kind of sliding against the door. He said it sounded almost like cloth, moving against the door. And he said that he was like, oh. So he backed up and he looked out the peephole again and he just sees blackness. And so at that point, he said he knew that something was there, and there was no doubt in his mind. He backed up and he said he freaked out. And he said that this thing kind of bumped against the door again and he heard a grunt. Then he said that at that point he noticed the door to the garage was wide open and the garage door was wide open. So he looks out. He doesn't see anything out in the driveway. So he closes the door and he locks it for what good that was going to do him. So he says, I'm standing there and I'm frozen. He goes, I don't know what to do. He goes, and I had a gun, but it was in the truck. He said, then he heard something in the garage and he was like, oh no, this thing is in the garage. And he's telling me this and he's like, I don't know what to do, man. I'm frozen. I don't know what to do. And he said that, it's going through his mind that he goes, what a fool that I was, to believe that I could deal with something like this. He's like, I was terrified, dude. I mean, he goes, I ain't gonna lie, I was terrified. And so he said he was standing there and he heard it sniffing around and growling, like a grunting, growling noise. And he said that it banged up against the door to the garage, like it went straight for the door. The doorknob kind of moved a little bit. He said it jiggled. Now I said, did it turn it or did it kind of just jiggle it? And he said, because I've talked to people who had said that this thing, that they turned the doorknob, you know what I mean? And he said, no, it didn't turn what I noticed, but I'm pretty sure it just kind of jiggled it. And he goes, but then again, I was so scared. So who knows? So anyways, he books out the front door. He just makes a split-second decision. He's going to bail. He's going to head for his truck because this thing bangs on the door again. And at this point, it was cracked. The door was cracking. So he ran out the front door. He said that he turned and the garage was right there. He looked into the garage because he heard a loud bang, pop, crack. And the thing had, I guess, it had gotten into the house. So he said that he pulled the emergency latch, I guess, for the garage door to pull it down, I don't know exactly how that works or whatever, but he said he pulled the garage door down just so if it tries to come back out, it would have to contend with the door. Maybe it couldn't open it, lift it the way, that we do. And I thought that's smart that he did that, Anyways, he made a break for his truck and he said, I didn't have one of those trucks with the boop boop. They just let you get in it. He's like, I had an old truck and I was trying to put the key in the hole. And he says, I literally was dropping my keys, dude. He goes, you would not believe. He goes, you see that happen in these movies. The way he says it is really funny. He's like, you see these pendejos doing it in the movies and you're like, why are you doing that, pendejo? And then he said that it was happening to him and he was just like so scared and so nervous. He said he finally got in, he got the truck, he got in and he was like, my pistol's right here. He reaches down, he grabs it and he's like, this thing comes running out after me. I'm going to shoot it. I got my gun right here, and he says that he's like sitting there thinking, maybe I should call the police because he didn't, when he was inside the house, he had told me that he had no bars. And he told me that at the beginning of the story. He goes, because I asked him, I said, do you have a cell phone? He said, no, it didn't have any signal out there. He goes, it didn't have any bars. And he's like, dude, he goes, I was mad. He's like, and I'm thinking, I'm immediately starting to drive down the road and I'm looking back and I'm, I was going to look for my phone. And I realized I left it in the house. So when I could get a signal, I left it on the counter or whatever. And, so he was freaked out. He looks back. Now, this is what he told me. Well, this part sounds kind of incredible, but this is what I was told. He looked back and that this thing was looking out the glass panel of the garage door. And he said that, and I asked him, I said, what did it look like? He said it looked like a big old bear with a wolf's head. That's all I could describe, like a bear wolf mix. And I said, what color was it? He said it was black. He said it was black, jet black, like just black as night. This solid black. And I said, and I asked him, I said, were you sure it was just solid? He goes, no, it was just solid black. He says he hears a crash. He looks back. And this thing is reaching through the panel with its hand kind of moving around down below the, like reaching down. You could see the arm coming out of the window. That was really interesting to me. So I asked him, I said, what did it look like? What did the arm look like? And he said it was just black, covered with hair, just like the face, and he said, but it had this weird looking paw hands. Now, I asked him to describe that. He said, I didn't look back a second time. He goes, I was gone. And he's like, and I got my gun right there in my hand and I'm driving down the road all crazy, and he's like, he's thinking, if this thing comes running alongside his truck, he's going to shoot it, he's going to start firing at it, and he just kept thinking that's what was going to happen. So he's hauling, he gets to this convenience store, I guess, right down the road, a few miles, whatever. He stops. He says, I had to just sit there in the parking lot and process what had just happened. And he's like, he goes, I literally broke down in tears. He goes, I couldn't believe what had just happened to me. He goes, I thought there's no way that just happened to me. He goes, I just was stunned. He goes, I had always made fun of these people. And at that point, his nephews were kind of laughing at him and Shane was laughing at him. And he was like, I'm sorry. And I thought he was kind of tearing up at the time, but he's kind of a big guy. He's like, I'm like a machismo, And so I was thinking, he's not going to start crying right now. But he didn't. He held his composure and he was like, I was wrong. These things exist. I can't believe what I saw. And he goes, but I'm telling you, he looked me in my eye and he said, Wolf, I'm telling you the absolute truth. There is no lie right here. I'm telling you what I saw. That is what happened to me. And then, I looked at everybody. They were kind of nodding their head and I was like, okay. I mean, you say that's what happened, He said, anyways, he goes, I get home and I'm telling my wife about it. I'm frantically telling her about it. He goes, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know, he said, I told my wife and she was just like in shock. She was like, she had heard the stories too from my family. Neither one of us really believed it, but he goes, I told her, I said, babe, look, this is real. This, I'm not kidding. He's like, luckily I had the pistol with me in the truck. So if that thing came out, I was going to start shooting it. And he said that she was like, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. She's like, the other day when I had the kids with me, I unloaded your gun and I put the bullets in the glove compartment. And he was like, what? And he was so frantic that he didn't even notice that there was no ammunition in the gun. So that peace of mind that he had by getting in the vehicle and thinking he had a pistol, which might not have done any good anyway. But I guess if you're driving and you're taking pot shots at it, maybe it would slow it down. I don't know. But there wasn't even any bullets in the gun. And he was just like, he goes, dude, I almost fainted. I was just like, man. And then he's like, at first, he goes, I don't think she believed what I was telling her. He goes, because she said, let's go get your phone. And he's like, no, we're not going back. Do not go there. We're not going back to that place. So he said the next day, the Lowrys came in and they were like, what the hell happened? He had left them a message, told them to give him a call. And they went back to take a look at the damage that this thing had done. And he said that he didn't know if these people really believed him, but that he didn't give a shit at that point. He was like, I don't care. And he said, I didn't give a, he goes, I wasn't going back to that place. He's like, and when we went, he goes, I went back, but I stayed out in the truck. I didn't even get out. And he said that my brother and my nephew, and they went in, they talked to him. Now, this is what Jerry told me. Now he told me, that's the nephew. He told me that he saw the damage this thing did. The garage door was bowed out and just literally like broken in half. Now, if you can just, I don't know how that would look. I tried to wrap my mind around that and wondered, like, how does a garage bent at a V, like, the way he said, and which to me would be like, at an angle, a 90-degree angle, I guess. I don't know. He said that it was bowed out and snapped. That the door from the garage going into the dining room or whatever, the entry room, I said dining room because I don't know exactly. I'm trying to make, my mind. He said that the door going into that entry room, that the door was cracked in the middle and broken off the hinges and that the paneling was busted out. The initial reaction from the Lowrys was like, this dude got high on some paint or something and he must have did this. But how did he do this? And so obviously he didn't do it. That was the linchpin. But what sold them on his story was the fact that there was a huge gash. Now I told you about this, Vic. There was a huge gash running along the little hallway when you first walk in. Javier said when you first walk in, the hallway is right there in the garage. That wall on the other side of the drywall is the garage. He said there was a huge 2-inch gash. They're cutting through the drywall. And that this thing had run its claws along that, apparently. And they didn't know how to explain that. And they were just like, what the? And then they said that there was a puddle of piss in the kitchen. And it just smelled horrible. Now that, I don't know what that was all about, why it does these things it does, or why it did that. I have no freaking clue. I mean, all I know is what they told me. This is what happened. This is what they say happened. So that's those stories from the Hernandez family, and that's the stories from Shane's family. So that's that, as they say.
Episode 117, GT.
This event happened back in 1981. I was 17 years old. It was really hot that night, and it would have been probably the latter part of July or perhaps the first week or two in August. I mean, it was really hot, and of course I was driving that night when it occurred, and I was driving with my windows down because I didn't have any air conditioning. But anyway, this event happened when my wife and I were first dating. I think maybe we had been dating maybe about a year. I had just gotten my driver's license. Most teenagers get their driver's license when they're 16. But I didn't get mine until I was 17 years old. My dad had just bought me a 1968 Dodge Coronet, and I really loved that car, and I was really proud of it. It was kind of a burnished copper color with metal flake paint. It had nice mags on it, jacked up in the rear end, you know how the folks did with the muscle cars back at that time. It had a 318 engine in it, and of course now there's a lot of bigger and better Mopar engines out there, but this engine had been bored out and it'd been built. It had quite a bit of power, and I had a nice set of cherry bomb mufflers on it, and man, I just loved the sound that it made as I drove along, as I downshifted or accelerated, the roar of that engine coming through those cherry bomb mufflers. And now that I think back on it, and since we talked the other day, I've been thinking a little bit more about the encounter and trying to make sense of it and why that it occurred. And I got to thinking about it. It's very possible I triggered the encounter that night, and really what I consider as an attack by what I was doing with the engine of that car, because, as I would go into curves and I'd downshift,
maybe, sometimes I was kicking it up into neutral and goosing it and, revving the engine. When I'd come out of the curves into the straightaways, I would kind of get into it just a little bit. And, just listening to the roar of that engine coming through those cherry bomb mufflers. And maybe, I don't know, maybe this thing was in the middle of a hunt as I was driving, and I'll tell in a moment where the event occurred. But as I was driving down this road, there was pasture fields on either side of me, bounded by high ridges and woodland. And there was cattle and horses in the fields. And in other places, there was silage corn. I don't know if you know what that is, but primarily in this part of the country, I live in East Tennessee, just a couple of counties to the northwest of the Smoky Mountains. And in our part of the country, it's primarily cattle farming, what people out west would call a small ranch operation. Primarily, they raise beef cattle, some dairy cattle, and they raise silage corn. And, of course, they harvest the ears of corn to feed the cattle and to feed hogs and things like that, horses. And they grind up the corn stalks and the leaves and everything and make what they call silage out of it. And they store it in silos, and they use that as feed for their cattle and horses and their hogs and things in the winter. And so I could see these cornfields, and it was a bright moonlit night, and I could see occasionally these cornfields. And also at that time, there was a lot of tobacco raised in this part of the country. Of course, there's not so much anymore, but back then just about everybody had their own patch of tobacco. They would raise tobacco and sell it. And I could see cattle and horses in the field. It was such a bright moonlit night. I could see in the fields almost as good as you could in the day. And also interspersed among the cattle and horses in the field were deer. And it's very possible that this thing was in the middle of a hunt and about to maybe spring on a deer or maybe even a cow or a calf. And I interrupted its hunt with the sound of this engine as I was driving down through here. But like I said, I live in East Tennessee, maybe about 500 yards south of the Virginia line. And my occurrence happened actually over the line in the state of Virginia. But I was going to see my wife, as I said, and I wanted to show her this car that I had gotten, that my dad had bought for me. I wanted to take her for a ride in it. I was real proud of it. I wanted her to see it. And I was going to visit her at her parents' house, which is actually the property that we live on now in our home. But she lived at that time, we were teenagers, and she lived at that time with her parents, and I lived with mine. This was several years before that we got married. But my grandparents, they lived on a road that's called Wagoner Hollow Road, and this road runs about 20, 25 miles long, and it begins in southwest Virginia, and it crosses over the line and passes through 2 counties in Tennessee as well. But the occurrence happened on the Virginia side of the line. Like I said, my grandparents lived on this Wagoner Hollow Road. I really don't know why they call it a hollow. It's really kind of a narrow valley, and just like most of the area around here, it primarily consists of narrow valleys and hollows, and bounded on all sides by high wooded ridges. We've got a lot of trees here. I mean, you could start from where I live, a squirrel could, and can just about, almost without any breaks, except for, where the roads do pass through, travel from my house through the state of Virginia all the way to Cumberland Gap into Kentucky, and almost never have to touch the ground. I mean, there's just woods everywhere on all the ridges all around, and this is how this valley was, this Wagoner Hollow Road. This is how it was. The road was real curvy, narrow country road, and it just kind of meanders through the valley all the way on the Virginia side and on the Tennessee side, with farmland on either side, and of course 3-strand barbed wire fences all along the way, and fields. The valley here, it goes anywhere from 300 or 400 yards on either side of the road, and in some places narrows down maybe to 150 yards or 100 yards or something like that, but it varies from different places. But anyway, I was going to take the route through this Wagoner Valley Road to go and see my wife. And my grandparents lived in this Wagoner Hollow Road. And my mother asked me if I would drop her off at my grandparents' house to visit with them while I went to see my wife, and then, come back and pick me up afterwards. And so I agreed to do that. So I took my mother to my grandparents' house, and I dropped her off, and I went on up to where my wife and I live now, to her parents' house, and I took her for a ride in the car, showed her the car, and I ate supper with them, and we stayed there and visited together till maybe about 11:15, something like that. And then I left, and I turned off the road that she lived on, where we now live, onto this Wagner Holler Road, and went back to pick my mother up at my grandparents' house. And now, as I said, this road, it's got a lot of sharp curves in it. There's some straightaways, but for the most part, it's just a windy, twisty, narrow country road. You can't go too fast. And of course, I just got my license. I was an inexperienced driver. My car, I hadn't had it too long, and I wasn't used to it. And so, of course, if you know anything about those muscle cars, they do great in the straightaway, and you can just fly with them. But they don't take curves too good, and so I couldn't go real fast. And I probably wasn't driving over 30 miles an hour at the maximum. And in a lot of cases, I was slowing down maybe to about 20 miles an hour. But in any event, I was going down through there, and I was downshifting and revving the engine and listening to the sound of the engine coming through those cherry bomb mufflers, and I was watching and looking at the cattle and the horses and the fields and everything, on either side as I was going down through there. And I was just getting ready to go into a long and sharp curve that curved around to the right hand. And I noticed on the right-hand side of the road, and as I was going down through here, like I said, the moon was lighting everything up, and I could see everything almost as good as I could during the daytime in the fields. But the ridges and the woods on either side, they just kind of appeared like clumps, shadowy clumps. I couldn't really see much detail from them. And as I began to go into this long curve to the right, there was a shadow that kind of detached from maybe about 100, 150 yards off on my right, kind of detached from the shadows of the tree line and started moving at an angle away from the tree line, almost paralleling my vehicle, but coming at an angle. And I could tell by the way that the road was curving around to the right and the angle that this thing was moving, but it was going to intersect my vehicle. And I mean, this thing was moving on. Now, what I'm about to tell you about, Vic, this all happened, and it couldn't be more than just a few seconds, maybe 20, 30 seconds, something like that, certainly less than a minute, and couldn't have been any longer than that. But it just seemed like time just slowed down to a crawl, and it just seemed like everything was moving in slow motion. I don't know what it was about it, but there was something about this figure that just unnerved me, and it just made me uneasy. This, whatever it was, this thing just didn't look, I couldn't really tell what it was about it, but there was something about it that just looked unnatural to me. Of course, I found out later on why that was as it got closer to me, and I could tell what it was. And this thing was actually taking a longer path of travel than I was the way that it was running, but I could tell, I mean, this thing was going to come in direct contact with me somewhere around this curve. And I mean, it was moving fast. I mean, super fast. I couldn't really tell what it was, but I mean, it was one of the fastest moving things that I'd ever seen. Anyway, as I'm coming around this curve, this thing is just keeping my attention, and my eyes are darting back and forth from the right. I have to look at the road or I'm going to run out of the road because I'm going around the curve, but it's drawing my attention. I keep looking at it and trying to figure out what this thing is and what it is that's so strange about the way that it looks. And it begins to draw a little bit closer to me. And, I kind of thought maybe when it first came out, maybe it might be a deer. There's a whole lot of white-tailed deer in this area that we live in, and pretty much on a daily basis when I'm going to work, I'll see one somewhere along the way that's been hit by a car and killed. And, I didn't want this thing to run out in front of me and hit my car. And for one thing, at that time in Tennessee, there was no law requiring you to have automobile insurance. And my dad, he didn't believe in having it. And so I didn't have any insurance on my car, and I didn't want this thing, whatever it was, to cause me to wreck or to hit my car and do damage to it, because I didn't have the money to fix it or to replace it. But then as I was watching this thing, I noticed that there was something strange about it. I noticed that whatever it wasn't running on all fours. Whatever this thing was, it was on 2 feet. I didn't understand what it was. It just seemed to me like, the only thing that I know of in this area, and we do have black bears, they're rare, but we do have some in this area, but a black bear just cannot move at the speed that this thing was moving at. A black bear, when it gets up on its hind legs, it's just not natural for it, and it just moves in a clumsy fashion, and this thing, whatever it was, it was just moving super fast, and it was just fluid in its motions, in the way that it ran, and no bear could get up on its hind feet and run in the way that this thing was running. But yet, it couldn't be a man. I knew that it could not be a man, because I ran track when I was in high school. I ran the 880 relay, ran the 440, and I knew that a human being could not run as fast as this thing was running. And I just couldn't understand what this thing was that was angling across this field and coming toward me, and I knew that was going to intersect me as it came across this field. And as I'm going along, it starts to get a little bit closer as it's running at an angle, but yet at the same time kind of parallel with my car. And it's keeping up with my car. It's keeping up with the speed that I'm going at, and I don't understand this. I don't understand how this thing can be going and keeping the same speed as my car. I'm coming into this sharp curve, and I've got to slow down. And I know that this thing pretty soon is going to come out, maybe jump out in front of me and meet the line of travel of my car. And as it drew closer, I began to see more details about this thing, and it for definite sure was running on its hind legs. It wasn't on all fours. It was on its hind legs like a man, but it wasn't like a man. This thing was on its hind legs, but it wasn't standing up fully erect like a human being does. This thing it kind of appeared stooped as it was running. It was standing up. It was on its hind legs, but yet it wasn't standing up straight. And this didn't look like a human figure. It looked like something totally different. It looked like something that, I'd never seen anything that looked like this thing. And as it begins to draw closer, I began to pick out more detail about it. And I can tell that whatever this thing is, it don't have knees like a human being does. This thing has hocks like a horse or a cow or a deer or something like that. But a four-legged animal like that cannot run on its hind legs like that. Cannot possibly move as fast and as fluidly and as swiftly as this thing was moving. And then I noticed, I could see in the moonlight that it looked like it had a big dog's head. That's all I know how to explain it. It had a long snout on it like a wolf or maybe like a German Shepherd. And it looked like it had long, tall ears that were standing straight up on the top of its head. And I could see that it had a long, bushy tail. And the only thing I know that I can think of that it reminded me of was a coyote's tail. But at that time, I don't think, we've got them here now, they came in here now, but I don't think we even had coyotes in this part of the country at that time. I'd never heard about it anyway. And there's no way that a coyote would be that big, and there's no way that it could run on its hind legs like this thing was running. And that tail, it stringed out behind it, that long bushy tail, and it was kind of bouncing up and down a little bit as it was running. And I noticed that this thing had arms, and that the arms, they were kind of pumping like a human being's, but, when a human runs, a human being pumps his arms almost as fast as his legs are moving, and this thing was kind of pumping them, but they weren't moving as fast as its legs were moving. And another thing that I noticed the majority of the time when a human being runs, a human kind of clenches their fist when they're running, and this thing wasn't doing that. It was almost holding its hands, and that's what they looked like. It didn't look like paws to me. I can only describe them as hands. It more or less looked like they were hanging almost limp as it ran, and I could see the fingers hanging down as this thing ran. And as it began to draw closer, I could see that it had hair or fur all over its body. I could see that, and I could tell that. I couldn't really tell for sure, but it looked to me like it was black. But later on, I realized that that's what color it was, but I really couldn't tell the color yet at this point. And so this thing begins to draw closer. And as I said, it was a really hot night, and I was driving along in my car, and I had my windows rolled down because I didn't have any air conditioning on it. And, you know, this thing keeps drawing closer and closer to me, and I just, you know, my unease just grows more and more, and I'm starting to get scared. I don't understand it. I don't know what this thing is. I just can't make out what this thing is. It don't look like anything that I've ever seen before. And it begins to draw closer. It gets close to the barbed wire fence on the right-hand side. And I think, well, maybe it's going to slow down, or maybe it'll veer off where it won't run into that barbed wire and it'll turn aside out of my way. But it didn't do that. Instead of doing that, this thing sped up. And instead of turning aside, it jumped right over the fence. And it landed on my side of the fence, in between the ditch line and the fence, and then it took another bound. And the next thing I know, this thing is out in the road. I mean, it's right next to my vehicle, and it scared me so bad that I jerked the wheel and I ran over into the left lane, and I was driving in the left-hand lane, and if there'd been a car coming, I mean, you know, it would have hit me head on, but it scared me so bad when this thing jumped across the fence, and I thought it was going to jump right into my vehicle, that I you know, just not thinking, instinctually, I just jerked the wheel to the left and went over as far as I dared into the left-hand lane. And this thing, it started running right along beside of me. And I want to tell you, Vic, like I said, I had the windows rolled down, but I had cherry bomb mufflers on that car, and if you know what they're like, they're loud. But yet, at the same time, I could hear the nails of this thing, the toenails, click, 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 clacking on the road as it ran along beside me. And I could see it good now. And, you know, I really didn't want to look at its face. I really didn't want to see its face. But I couldn't help it. It's just like I couldn't help myself. I had to. And, I mean, this thing was tall. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. It towered over the top of my car. And it was running along beside me. It couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 feet off the passenger side of my car. Just, I mean, right even with my passenger side window. I could see it just as clear as day as it ran along beside of me. And I really didn't want to see its face. But I felt like I just couldn't help it. I had to. And so, and it was so tall, I had to kind of lean over, almost lay over, on the right side, kind of in the seat, and prop myself up with my hand on the right side while I hung on to the wheel and drove with the left to get a look at it and to see its face. And I wish that I hadn't, but I did. You know, this thing definitely, I mean, it had to be, like I said, it had to be 7 feet tall, Vic. Oh, God. This thing, it looked like a gigantic wolf or maybe something like a German Shepherd or something like that, but its ears were different. They were slim and they were high and pointed, like I said, on top, and had kind of like tusks sticking out. And, you know, I've heard a lot of people describe these things, and I've heard them say that, you know, they couldn't tell what they were. But I'm here to tell you this thing was a male. There was no doubt about that. I mean, it was right there in the open, in the clear, just as plain as day, right in front of me. And I'm not going to use any kind of vulgarity or anything like that, but let me just put it this way. As I leaned over and looked out the vehicle, I mean, I could tell just exactly what it was, because it was right there at the base of his belly, right in front of me, and I could tell just as plain as day that it was a male. This thing is running along beside of me, and you know, at first it's like it's not even seeing me. It's like it's not even paying attention to me in my car. Like it don't even notice us. or like it just don't even care about me being there in that car as it's running along. And you know, my eyes are darting back and forth, like I said, from the road to this thing as I'm trying to drive around this curve. And man, I wanted to hit the gas, and I wanted to just floor it, and I wanted to get out of there. But I didn't dare do it because I was afraid I would run out of the road and run into the ditch, and I would wreck. And I'd be with this thing, and I mean, I'd just be right there at its mercy. But yet I wanted to, because I could tell. I mean, this thing had arms. If it hadn't had them, didn't have them bent and wasn't pumping them as it ran, this thing's arms would have hung down below its hocks, Vic. And I know that if it wanted to, this thing could have reached right in my car window and right over to the driver's side, from the passenger side, and this thing could have grabbed me, and it could have drugged me right out of the car. If it wanted to, it could have just ripped my head off, or it could have leaned in my car window, and it could have bit my head off. I don't know. I know it could have, and I wanted to get out of there, but I didn't dare, because I was in this steep curve, and I knew that if I hit the gas, this car probably wasn't going to be able to handle the curve, and it was going to run off in the ditch, and I was going to wreck, and I was going to be there alone with this thing, and I was going to be at its mercy. And like I said, I mean, I got a good look at it. I got a real good look at what this thing looked like, and it was just as jet black as it could be. It had hair or fur over most of its body, maybe about 3 or 4 inches long, thick fur, and it was glossy. It had a sheen on it. It was reflecting the light from that full moon. And, I mean, it was just thick all over its body, except for, it kind of thinned out, down on its belly, kind of, you know, up above its legs. But other than that, it was just thick hair, maybe about, 3, 4 inches long, and up around its head, the back of its head, and kind of like down over, I don't know what to call it other than shoulders, down over his shoulders. It was maybe about 5, 6 inches long. It's just a little bit longer. I've heard people describe it kind of as like the mane of a lion, but it wasn't that long. It wasn't that much difference in the length of the hair, but you could tell that it was just a little bit longer. And this thing, like I said, it had a long snout on it, like a German Shepherd or like a wolf. And I could see as it was running along beside me, I could see its mouth was kind of relaxed and open, and I could see that it had, like, you know, jagged shaped teeth, like a dog's got on the side of its mouth. But it had fangs that were about maybe 4 inches long that were hanging down over its bottom lip, and the bottom ones were disappearing up into the top lip. But its mouth was kind of parted, and it kind of had its tongue hanging out on the left side of its mouth, just like a dog does as it runs along, as it's painting. And like I said, this thing wasn't paying a bit more attention to me than if I wasn't even there. And for a little while, it just ran along beside me and just didn't pay me any attention. But that didn't last. Just slowly, seemed like it took forever, but just slowly, it started to turn its head, and it looked at me. And you know, I know that you said that you shouldn't, and I've heard other people say that you shouldn't, but I couldn't help it. I looked full in its eyes. I wish that I hadn't. I wish I'd never seen it. I wish I could erase the picture of what I saw from my mind, but I can't. And, you know, I've heard people say that they had amber or yellow eyes or red or orange-like eyes, but that's not what I saw that night. This thing had great big black eyes, and I couldn't see any kind of pupil. I couldn't see any kind of white or anything like that, but all I could see was black, and then they just looked as black to me as a bottomless pit. They just seemed soulless to me. And I tell you, Vic, I just had a sense of evil that came over me. And this thing, when it looked at me, it was like that it could look through me and look to my very soul. And like I said, I just felt like I had been touched by evil. I don't know how else to explain it. And there was such a fear. And I wanted to scream or to holler out or do something. but it just seemed like my mouth just dried up like cotton, and there wasn't a sound that would come out. And I wanted to get out of there. I wanted to get away from this thing, but I couldn't because I was afraid I was going to wreck. And then it came closer to my vehicle, Vic, and it leaned down. It leaned in, and mind you, this thing is running beside my car the whole time. And it leaned over, Vic, and it stuck its head in my window, and it grabbed hold of my door with its right hand, and that, I don't know how to describe it as other than that. It was a hand, and I know that people have described this thing as, to say that they kind of look like raccoon hands, and maybe in a way that's right, or maybe a mix between the hand of a raccoon and maybe the hand of a monkey, something like that. But this thing had huge hands, and it had long black nails, maybe about 3 inches long, 2 or 3 inches long, on the ends of its nails, long black thick nails. And this thing put its right hand on my door, and I could hear it. It put its left hand on my doorknob, and it was jerking at my door, and it was jiggling my door handle. But thank goodness, when I had been at my wife's house, then my girlfriend, and I'd been at her parents' house, I'd locked the car. And when I came back out, I didn't unlock that door because nobody was going to be riding with me at that point before I went back to get my mother. And so it wasn't able to get my door open. But this thing was leaning in my window, and it was looking right at me. And it seemed like that it curled its lips back, and I know it snarled at me, but I don't really remember hearing it. All I could hear was the sound of my engine and the sound of its toenails as it ran along beside my vehicle, going clack, 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 clack on the pavement. And this, it breathed on me, and it was hot breath, and it was, you know how people describe that breath as being kind of fetid, and seemed like I could smell blood and maybe decaying flesh as it breathed on me. It was horrible. And, I thought I was dead. I thought this was the end of me. I thought I was a goner. I thought I was a dead man for sure. At just about that time, the curve ended, and I came into a straightaway, and I just hit the gas and pushed it to the floor, and I took my eyes off of it, and I looked ahead. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw its nails I saw it lose a grip on my car door, and I saw its nails rake across the top of my door. And its head disappeared from my window. And I don't know, I had to be going 70 or 80 miles an hour. I don't know for a time there. I just had to peel out there and get away from this thing. And as I drove away from it, as I pulled away from it, I looked in my rearview mirror, and I could see it getting smaller and smaller as it began to slow down. And the last thing I remember, the last thing that I saw, this thing veered off to the right again and jumped over the fence and disappeared into that field. And I'm telling you, Vic, I've never been so scared in all of my life. It was just absolutely horrifying. And I went on and drove on, and this happened maybe about 2 miles from my house where I live now, and maybe it couldn't have been over a mile and a half from my grandparents' house. And I went on there, and I picked my mom up, but I never told her a thing about what happened. And I never told my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time. Like I said, I never told her, and I've never told her in the 35 years since this has happened. I never told any of my friends. I didn't tell my dad. I've never told any of my children. I've never told anybody until I filed the report with you the other day. And you called me. I've never talked to anybody about this and told them about what happened. I tell you, it was the most horrifying experience of my life. And my dad, he asked me the next day where the scratches came from on my vehicle. And I told him that I run out of the road and I run into a thorn bush, and that's where the scratches came from. And I tell you, Vic, I love that car. I loved it. But I could not keep that car thinking about what happened and what I went through that night. I just couldn't keep it. I had to get rid of it. And I traded that car for a 74 Nova. and I got rid of it. And you know, I as time went on, I mean, I couldn't sleep. I didn't sleep for nights after this. If I would drift off to sleep, I'd wake up having nightmares, seeing this thing happen over and over again, and I couldn't keep it out of my mind when I'd lay in my bed, and I'd think about it, and just go over and over and over what happened in my mind. And you know, that night, I didn't know what I'd seen. I really didn't understand what it was. You know, I'd read about and heard about werewolves and things like that, but I really didn't connect this thing with that. And you asked me, you mentioned, maybe in the pre-interview, you mentioned about horror movies, and I can tell you right now, I don't watch horror movies. I hear people talk about saying it looked like this werewolf in this movie or that movie, but I've never seen them. The only werewolf movies that I ever saw were the old Lon Chaney movies when I was a kid. That's the only ones I've ever watched. Anything that come out after 1981, I can tell you right now, I've not seen it because I won't watch them. My wife, when my kids were little, my sisters would come up and they loved horror movies, and my wife loves horror movies, and so did my children. And my wife, you know, they'd go, and back then we had VCRs, and we rented movies, and they'd go out and they'd rent horror movies, and I'd go to bed, or I'd go off in another room. I could not watch them, and I can't watch them to this day. I told you this caused just extreme bad behavior in me. I mean, I engaged in things. I'm not going into details what they were. I hate that I did them, but I did things that I know now was trying to deal with this. But, you know, I put it out of my mind, and I suppressed it for all those years. But yet there was something that bothered me. And, you know, my house is only about 40 or 50 yards from the woods. I've got woods in behind my house. I've got woods on the right side of my house. I've got woods on the left side of my house. And I've always had an anxiety about living so close to the woods. And I know now that that's why that is. And when I go out in my backyard, I just can't stay out there because I feel like that there's something out there, that there's something lurking in the woods that's looking at me and that's watching me. And I just can't stand it, and I have to go back in the house. And, you know, I used to want to hunt, but in 35 years after this thing has happened to me, since I saw this thing that I now know, I couldn't explain it then. I thought maybe it might be a demon. I thought maybe I was having a waking nightmare, or maybe it was just my imagination. I just didn't have any explanation for it. And I now know that that thing was a dog man. I didn't know about them then, and I didn't understand, but now I know that's what that thing was. And I tell you, Vic, like I said, I used to want to hunt, but I can't do it. In the past 35 years, I have not hunted one time. I own guns. I love guns, but the only thing that I do is target shoot with them. I don't take them into the woods because I just can't do it. I mean, I've tried to go a couple of times, but I just couldn't stand it. I just had to leave because there's something out there, and I know it's out there. And, you know, like I said, I put this thing out of my mind, and I really wasn't thinking about what it was. I know what it is now because when I heard the description of a dogman on Dogman Encounters, this all came flooding back to me, and I know what it is now. And I tell you, Vic, I know that these things are real. I know that night it wasn't a demon, it wasn't my imagination, it wasn't some kind of waking dream. I know that I saw a real, living, breathing animal. And I tell you, I believe these things are dangerous. I mean, I hear about these people that want to have an encounter and go out and hunt for them or hunt for Bigfoot. You know, there was a time I thought maybe I might like to do something like that. But I tell you right now, I think they're crazy. These things are nothing to fool with. And I don't think anybody ought to go out there looking to meet up with one of these things. You may meet up with it for real. And you may wish, like I wish, that you had never seen the thing. And I tell you, I've heard you say that you shouldn't ever look these things in the eye, but I did that night. I looked this thing full into the eye, and it felt like it was looking into my very soul. I felt like it knew everything about me. And when it looked at me that night, and something else that I forgot to mention a while ago, when it stuck its head in my open window and looked at me, and curled its lips back. I mean, like I said, it was like it was giving me a seditious grin, and it licked its chops. You know, you've seen a wolf or a dog do that. It licked its chops at me, Vic, like it was telling me, I know that your lunch There's not a thing that you can do to stop me if I want to hurt you, and you look awful delicious to me. That's how I feel. That's what it looked like to me, that it was conveying to me that night. And I tell you, I was scared to death. I was horrified. I've never, ever, ever experienced anything in my life that scared me so bad as that did that night. Oh, it was awful. And basically that's what happened to me, Vic.
Episode 124, Gene Rodriguez.
J.C. Johnson is a dear friend of mine, and he's a mentor, and I've been learning a lot from him as we share our experiences and our research and work together for Crypto Four Corners International. He flew me there specifically to investigate with him and do a piece on what's been going on in his friend's, he's now my friend's, property, and it's been going on for decades, for generations. So Ron is the third generation that has been encountering these dogmen. So when I got there, it was already under the premise that there's activity here consistently all the time, and it's been happening for generations. It's so frequent that they see the dogman family that lives there, that they have encounters, that they have names. The dogmen have names that they have tracked the family alongside the dogman family, alongside their own family, and have determined, just based on time and biology, that the dogmen of today are the grandchildren of the dogmen that Ron's grandparents were dealing with. And Ron now is a good friend of mine. He's a very nice man. He's got a very nice property up there in northern Minnesota, very close to the Canadian border. When I got there, it was afternoon. We had just gotten done, JD, which is JC's son, and I and JC had just gotten done shooting some M4s and shotguns and just practicing in our range time, because I got certified while I was up there too to conceal carry in all the blue states. So I'm really proud of that and happy of that and grateful for that. But we were doing that for some time before we ever left to go up north. And when we got there, it was a perfectly sunny afternoon. It was mid-September, and it was, as this year has been unseasonably warm. It was just a real mild day. I remember we were just wearing sweatshirts. It wasn't very cold at all. Everything was still completely in full bloom from the summertime. Maybe not full bloom, but, everything was still green, and just all the leaves around the trees. The trees had not even really started to turn at all, the colors even. It was just like everything was, all the grass was long, all the leaves were out, just everything was still pretty much in summer mode. I remember while we were on the road that Ron lives on, it's just way out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, just way out in the middle of nowhere. It's just beautiful country. It reminds me a lot of northern Wisconsin, except northern Wisconsin is a lot more piney. This is a lot more just regular, like maples and oaks and stuff, and it's just gorgeous. But I noticed that as we were getting closer to Ron's property, just the mood started to change a little bit. Like, it was just a vibe. It was a vibe that we were all, I didn't say anything for a while, but eventually the silence was broken as I was driving in with JC. JC's son was behind us. Do you feel that vibe? As we're getting closer to his house, and he's like, yeah, it is weird here. And JC has already had handfuls of encounters over at Ron's by this time too. And he doesn't know if I'm going to be encountering anything or everything or what. And the main concern as we were driving in too, and mine was, there was one dog person, I should say, in particular. Well, she's a female, and the way that this family of dog men tend to behave, it's as if the female is in charge, like it's a Native American group. Some of them are matrilineal. Well, this one seems to be matrilineal, and forgive the language, but they are dog people. They call her the bitch, and her name is also Allura. She's just territorial. She has features that are female, you know what I'm saying, on her chest. She has a fondness and a proclivity for particularly JC and Ron. She'll leave her scent marking on JC's tent when he camped there. Like I said, Ron's family has been having, the whole time they've been there, encounter after encounter that they live alongside these dog people, which is a lot different than most people's encounters, because most people's encounters is that the dog people are very territorial. If you see them on your property, they usually drive you out. You know, there's been sieges I've heard of. They want the people out of there, and they will scare them within inches of their lives to get them out of there or attack them and all of that. And it's just not like that in this case. They live alongside each other. So to get back to the story, like, okay, so we're driving in, and, you know, like I said, it's a beautiful day, and it's crystal clear out. The sky is blue, and we just get an eerie feeling from the get-go. So when we park, you know, we all get out, and I meet Ron, and Ron's got 3 big, beautiful dogs. One of them's a German Shepherd, which is my favorite, and they're just all big and fluffy and awesome, and, you know, we make our introductions, and JD right off the bat says, you know, I thought I saw something kind of like, I don't know, something weird out of the corner of my eye when we were coming in. And I'm like, okay, you know, who knows? Could have been a deer, could have been anything, but, you know, we all noted that. And right away, you know, JC kind of just launches into everything that goes on there, which is just so much. I mean, there's just so much to say about what goes on in that property. It's just, like I said, like it's an almost everyday thing where either Ron says he sees the heads peering into the windows. He'll wake up in the morning and see fresh tracks that are as wide as the tires on his truck. They'll be kind of like pronged feet, canine obviously, and just, like I said, wide as the tire track. So JC kind of just goes over everything, and then he says a couple days before I even get there, he's like, Alora's been gone. Like, she hasn't been seen hide nor hair in some time, and Ron thinks she's still gone doing whatever she's doing. And so I'm like, okay, good, because, well, before I even got there, I was kind of just worried, like, well, if this Alora dog man or dog person is that way with JC and Ron, like, has some kind of affinity for them, like, how will she feel about another female being thrown into the mix, since Ron doesn't really have other guests come in that aren't kin? So I was kind of nervous about that, because she's all well and good with them being males, but what about me? Like, will she be threatened? Will she hate me? You know, what's going to happen here? So that being said, I'm like, okay, cool, you know, she's gone. But then also in the corner of my mind, I'm like, well, rats, I hope I still have an experience. Like, I hope I still see something. The day continues, and we just kind of shoot the breeze a little bit. We're all getting acquainted. We go inside. There's another friend of Ron's that's been there. He got there earlier that day. And we're all talking about how JD and I want to go do some recon in the forest. Now, the forest is, when you pull up to the house, there's just a big gravel area where he's got like a tool shed about 40 yards away from the house proper. There's a big old driveway. There's a fire pit. It's like a little bit of a lawn area, and then there's a trail that goes up to the forest, and it's some, like, I would say like 300 yards away from the house, maybe 400 yards away from the house. Before you even get that far to the forest, there's like I said, the trail, and on the right there's bee houses. There's about 4 or 5 bee houses, and that's about 40 yards away from the house proper. And then there's a little ridge of trees that leads into the main forest part. And back there he's got alfalfa fields in the forest, like intermittently spaced out. He grows alfalfa. So, okay, it's still midday. It's around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and JD and I are like, okay. He's like, it's pretty weird, Jane. He's like, this is almost a year to the day that I was here last. My first time was last year to almost the day. I'm like, wow, that's cool. He's like, I'm going to take you back there. I'm going to take my AR-15. You can have a pistol. And I'm all excited because I just got certified, and, you know, I have my holster on. JC gave me a tack vest, so I'm wearing a tack vest. I have the video cam recorder that JD just got me, a nice new digital one. I had it in my front vest. JC's like, I want you to film my son while you're in the car. You know, ask him questions about what he saw, where he's going to take you, the prints he saw, everything. Make sure you get some nice footage of where he was and where you are now, you know, and just record all of that. And I'm like, yeah, for sure. And we're excited, and I'm excited. And so he takes me up there, and I got the camera rolling on him, and I'm asking him questions, and like, so it's been a year to the day. And I'm like, well, tell me where you're taking me now. And he's like, well, we're going to go to the edge of the forest right now, and I'm going to show you pretty close to the edge of the forest where we first come in. There's a couple of little trails for hunting purposes. You can drive a vehicle through them. They're that wide. There's just trails down the middle of the forest and just, through the forest, certain ones. And it's cleared out just enough for a vehicle to get through. The first thing he took me to was this place he calls the OP, which stands for Observational Point. Now, JD has been deployed to Afghanistan a couple times that I know of, probably more. He is a highly decorated Army veteran. He has had firsthand combat many times. He's been the hero of a few different situations. He knows what it's like to be in a high-stress situation where, like I said, there's combat going on, and you got to survive, you got to do your mission, all that stuff under high stress. And he's also trained as a tracker, so he knows what he's doing. So he takes me to the OP, the observational point. It's a high bluff. Like I said, it's a little hill, and all this grass is around. It's tall grass, and in the middle of the tall grass, on the very peak of this hill, you can see how 15 feet in diameter, probably 20 feet in diameter, you can see squashed down grass. And JD always refers to these dogmen here as lazy hunters because you can see how he's like, here's where I saw some tracks before, and then sure enough, we see newer tracks. I don't know if they were made probably within the last couple of days. It hadn't rained, by the way, in at least 3 or 4 days before we got there. So there were some pretty decent-sized tracks that we saw. He's like, I saw them here before. And like I said, there's squashed down grass, and he's like, look here, Jane. He's like, stand here. He's like, look how you can see Ron's house perfectly, and then also Ron's neighbor's house perfectly. He's like, that's why I mean the observational point. Like, these things can look at both properties, clear view, unobstructed, and also see for a long distance whether there's any deer or anything crossing the paths here so they can hunt. Lazy hunters, they can easily see. So I'm like, wow, cool. I'm looking at all this evidence and it's like, wow, this is awesome. Like, this is crazy. I can't believe I've been researching all this for so long and reading about all these experiences, and here I am looking at physical evidence right here, just right here. And here I just got a head full of stories of, just a couple days ago, Ron sees them. He sees them all the time. JC too. And so I take some good video shots of that, and I ask him some questions, and we get back in the truck, and he's like, okay, so we're going to go back into the forest where I was. We're going to go on foot. Eventually, I want to lead you to where he calls it like a lair. He's like, deep in this forest, like at a certain point I'm going to take you, you can see that there's structures made, and it's an obvious manipulation with something that has the ability to make structures. Like I say, like you can see that it's been manipulated, that it's some kind of place they like to go or something, So I'm like, okay. Like I said, it's a really weird feeling back there. It's just a very heavy, noticeable, thick feeling, like you can cut it with a knife. We're back there, and he's taking me around the forest, and we're finding some prints. Now that we're so far away and we're deep into the forest, I'm starting to get a little uneasy. I'm with JD, so it makes me feel a lot more confident, but yet still, I got my weapon, he's got his. And while we're walking through, like I said, before I ever got there, I've heard so many stories of when people say, I was in the forest and all of a sudden it went dead quiet. All right, well, that happened. The first time that happened with JD and I, while we were walking through the forest, it was crazy. The forest was alive with animals. Well, it was alive with birds. They were very, very noisy. The crickets were out. It was like a late summer day in the middle of September. Everything was very, very active. And you could hear everything, that the forest was alive. But while we were walking and looking, the forest went quiet. And that's when he was like, I can tell when the change in him, when he got serious, he's like, take a knee. And he said it very quietly. So the forest went quiet. He's like, take a knee. And he said it under his breath, real quiet. And he's like, be quiet. Don't say anything. Don't say a word. Breathe through your mouth. And when that happened, my heart started pounding through my chest. I could feel it in my throat. In fact, when I'm talking about it now, it's like reliving the moment. Like, I was so afraid. I was certain that something was watching us. Certain. And when the forest goes quiet like that in an instant, it's just the most, I call it a disgusting feeling, because you know that something is watching you and it's a predator. And it's an apex predator, and it's just a horrible, horrible feeling because you don't know where it's coming from, and that's why he told us to take a knee so we can become as quiet as possible, so we can become completely aware of every sound. So that way, well, during that dead silence, if we heard a twig snap, we'd hear it. We would be in that position just watching and waiting and listening until the forest came back alive with the noises. And it did eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, probably was only 5 minutes. And the forest would come back alive, and we'd start walking very cautiously again. He was, trying to remind me nicely as possible, like, please try to be quiet as possible, harness your Apache, your Apache blood, and just try to be stealthy. And so I'm like, okay. And so the forest went quiet at least 4 more times. And every time that horrible heart-pounding feeling where it's like, okay, what am I doing here? Like, this is too scary. And, but, I just kept pressing on because I went through all this trouble. JC did, JD did, and I really did. I really did want to be there, and I wanted to collect the evidence. So, I just pressed on. I got brave. I mustered up the courage, and we eventually made it to the lair. And when we were there, we walked across the trails that go through the center of the forest that a vehicle can go through. So, like I said, it's dry dirt. It's not muddy. So we were walking through one of them that cut through, and he's trying to remember himself, too, where it is. So we're walking up to it, and that's basically, again, while we're there, we're approaching this area where he's like, I know that something must come here frequently because look, Jane, he's like, we're approaching, he's like, it's still that way. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so freaky. All of this is real. It's one thing to write about it and listen to it and hear other people talk about it and think in your head, oh yeah, I believe that it exists. I did believe it existed beforehand, but it's another thing entirely to be there and looking at even secondhand evidence. Even just seeing a structure is just really, really, really kind of scary. Because that when you're seeing it with your own 5 senses, that it's there, it's real, and plus you're physically there. So we're approaching the area, and I'm looking at the structures myself with my own two eyes, and that's another time when the forest went silent. And there's a couple times where he told me to put my hand on my gun, unholster it. So the thing about JD is that he wouldn't tell me when he observed certain things that were approaching a danger zone, maybe because he didn't want me to panic. Because I was on the verge of panicking a couple of times. Like when he told me to unholster my weapon and put my hand on my gun while we were there in the lair area, or whatever you want to call it. It's just a horrible, horrible feeling. You just don't know what's going to happen. And my heart was just beating out of control. I didn't know how much more I could stand of it. So I'm recording as much as I can off and on. There's times when he's like, shut it off, it's more important to be safe than capture evidence right at this point, because there's just a lot we were saying. And so I'm like, please, can we go back? After we walked through it, we went into the lair. We looked at the structure itself. It was like a little bit, like you walk through the forest and there's a little bit of the clearing. And you can see, like, again, there's pressed down area in the bush where there's something that's huge laying there. Again, it's like 15 feet diameter. But here is like 20, 25 feet. And you can see, like, against some trees that there's like a big rectangle almost of just branches that are arranged that are sticking up and then over. And it looks like a little bit like a lean-to. Only it's not leaning. It's just like, I can't explain it. It's like a Stonehenge shape, like where the branches are sticking straight up, and then you got ones that are like sticking across to make like a rectangle type of thing. And so like we went through that area, and the whole idea was to go around and go back to the car, his Jeep. So we eventually get there, steadily, and we don't want to make a lot of noise because we are aware after the forest going quiet that many times that there's obviously something there besides us. So we get there, and I'm just like, oh my God, like that really happened. And I'm like, okay, let's go. And we get into the vehicle, and we're driving away back towards Ron's, and he said, that's obviously a lure, an entrapment lure. I'm like, what? He's like, I just saw something just kind of poke out and shake the trees enough, and I know what they're doing. And he's like, I've seen that happen in Afghanistan before. He's like, they're trying to garner our interest enough to go back there. And I'm like, well, why would they want us back there? We're just there. He's like, I don't know, probably to maybe a trap or something. He's like, I don't know, but we're not doing it. We're not going to take the bait. He's like, they're baiting us. So I'm like, okay, let's go. So we go, and we head back, and I'm like all excited and stuff. I got all this footage, and we get into the house, and, you know, JC is like, so what'd you find? And I'm like, oh my gosh, we found so much. You know, we found the OPs, just like JD remembers. Like, everything is squashed down just the same before. There's still tracks there. Like, there's new ones. You know, I'm all excited. I'm talking a million miles an hour, and he's like, wow, cool. He's like, oh yeah, I forgot to say, while we were back there, that was one of the more harrowing parts. While we were leaving, we heard a howl, a straight up howl. And that was right around the time when he saw the forest kind of jiggle to try to get us back. Like, we heard something go, ow, and it was to the left of where we were, pretty far away. And we were like, oh my God, you know, we heard it. So we get back, and we're kind of like briefing JC, and he's like, did you hear that howl, by the way? And I'm like, yeah. We're both like, yeah, we heard it. He's like, yeah, that was, and I'm like, where was it? He's like pointing to the same direction that we were at. So it was like up and to the left of him. Yeah, and it was, I guess it was to the right of where we were, but regardless. So like, we're telling him about everything, and I remember distinctly too, by the way, I put the camera on the kitchen table, and we had been in and out of that house all day, going to the fire, you know, making food, coming in and out with the dogs and stuff like that, just walking around, and we shot off a couple guns and stuff. He's got targets, and, you know, I walk in to look at my camera and to look at the footage, and I can't find it anywhere. You know, it was something that was bothering me the whole day while I was there, because not only did I have awesome footage on it from, like, the whole time I was there, but JC just got that thing for me, you know, and it's totally embarrassing to just lose something that you just got that was a gift for you. And, you know, eventually I told Jay, I'm like, JC, I can't find the camera anywhere. He's like, I'm like, I know that I put it on the table because it was in my front pocket in my tack vest, and I put it on the table, and I just don't know where it could be. And he's like, well, Jane, he's like, that same thing happened to me once. He's like, I know I put my sunglasses down on the counter here. He's like, this happened to me like a year ago. He's like, I put my glasses down on the counter here. I step outside of the house. I come in, they're gone. Ron finds them on the kitchen table 6 months later. There are my glasses. He's like, Jane, they come in the house. So he's like, these dogmen, they come in the house. They look in the windows. They're just all around all the time. And for instance, the other day, a few weeks ago, Ron was telling me how his friend that I met was deer hunting, and just to see what would happen since there was particularly high activity that week, they left the deer carcass out with the organ meat in it, so the organs, and they saw the silhouette of a dog man. They know who it is too. They know it's a juvenile, a young male. They saw him take out the livers and you know, everything. And they saw him do it. You know, they were about 300 yards away, but they saw it. They saw it happen, and, you know, sure enough, the organs were gone. Their eyes weren't playing tricks on them. They come up to the carcass sometime later, and sure enough, all the organs were gone. So that's what happened the first part of the day. Then more things happened later that night, and I can go into that right now if you like.
Please do.
Okay, so some time passes and sun sets, and we're all pretty excited from just the little recon mission that we did right then and there. Now, another thing that's distinguishable about that property is that there's not only dogmen there, but there's Sasquatch there as well. And they all seem to live side by side. And while we were gone, JC also, like, I should add, like, he was hearing stuff, like, he has something about him where the Sasquatch know him. Like, no matter, like, they just, it's weird because, like, once you have an encounter, it seems like it's like an egg yolk has been broken. Like, there's like a mark that's made on you or something. And it seems to me that once a person has an encounter, certain people, especially, like, they'll tend to have repeat. Well, JC is obviously, he's pretty well known. He has lots of videos and documentaries that he's made, and he just has an affinity for the furry people, he calls them. And, like, he was saying, like, as the sun set and when it was dark, he's like, yeah, we're surrounded right now. Like, there's Squatch all around us. And he's like, I know this for a fact. He's like, here's what I'm going to do. He's like, Jane, you hold these flashlights. We're all going to go down this trail. Like, if you remember, I was talking about the bee houses that were not too far from the house, to the right of the house, you know, up the trail. There's the bee houses, and there's that little patch of forest that leads into the big part of the forest. And he's like, here's what I'm going to do. He's like, Jane, take all these flashlights. We're all going to go up the trail. We're all going to go here past the bee houses. I'm just going to introduce us all. I'm going to say to the Sasquatch that are all around us right now, I'm going to say to them, we mean no harm. We just want to basically hang out. You know, how are you? We're just friends. We're not going to bother you. And, you know, just how are you? You know, kind of thing. So, you know, at this point, I'm like, hey, that'd be cool if something happened. I don't know. You know, I don't know what to expect. It's pretty fantastic to think that they're surrounding you, first of all, then to think that he's going to say hi to one. You know, you don't know what's going to happen. So he's like, who wants to come with me? And there's one guy named Bryce who's never had an encounter with a cryptid before. He was like me. I never had an encounter with a cryptid before. I've had plenty of encounters with all kinds of different things, but never a cryptid. So he's never had an encounter with a cryptid. He's like totally excited about it. He's like, I'll go. So we're all nervous, of course, and we're all got that adrenaline going. And we walk up the trail, and I've got the flashlight. JD, by the way, is super excited about this equipment that he has. It's the night vision goggles. It's like an Army issue, but it's a little bit of an older technology. What they have now is even way better than what he has, but it's still pretty awesome. It makes everything look green. You can be looking at stark darkness at night, and everything illuminates up perfectly, and it's green, and you can just look at everything awesome. And it happened to be a full moon that night, too. So we're trading the goggles back and forth as we're walking up the trail. And it wasn't a long walk. It was only 40 yards. So we go up, and then we cross over past the bee house. Well, actually, we stay on the trail. JD and I and Ron stay on the trail. And JC's like, okay, now we're going to go into the forest, and we're going to make our introductions after we walk up a little bit. So Bryce and him go walking up, and JD has the night vision goggles before the camera lens. So he's filming it, but he's filming it through the night vision, so you can see everything pretty well. And while he's filming it, he's about, I don't know, like 6'1" or something, or maybe 6 feet, and I'm 5'3", so I'm on my tippy toes. I'm looking over his shoulder, so I can see what he's looking at through the night vision. And poor Ron, he's a giant man. He's like 6'4", 6'5". He's like in the background just watching everything. And here I am, like little me, just looking through the night vision, peering over at John's shoulder, and that's when JC starts doing his, whoo, oh, you know, kind of thing, like, hey. And we're just kind of like standing there like, whoa. And I can see JC and Bryce. Bryce has a flashlight. They're kind of obscured by some trees, but I can still see them. And they're pointing, they're facing to my right, but which is in front of them. So they're looking straight ahead of themselves. And I'm looking right in front of myself, and it's to the right of them. They only have like one flashlight, but JC's telling Bryce to not shine it at the forest where he is directing his calls, because he doesn't want to make anything that's bashful over there, you know, not want to make itself known. So I think that was his reasoning. And so he makes his calls and starts talking, and I'm looking over JD's shoulder, and sure enough, right behind this pine tree, it's really hard to gauge how tall things are from that far of a distance. But right behind this pine tree was a Bigfoot. And I could see it plain as day. Plain as day. Well, of course, through the night vision goggles, but there it was right in front of us. And boy, that's when I was just like, I wasn't scared. I was just so excited. All these things are going through my mind, and like my emotions. I was just so excited. I'm like, this is so real. Like, oh my gosh, this is happening. Look at it. And I have footage of it. I'm like, JD, you see that? You see that? It's right there. It's right there. Oh my God. He's like, yeah. He's like, yep, definitely. And, you know, he's pretty like mellow, even keel. He doesn't react very strongly. He kind of keeps everything, you know, plays his cards close to the vest. So I'm just like, oh my gosh. And JC is like talking to it, and you can just kind of see it peek its head around the freaking pine tree and look at them and then go back. Because mind you, the Squatch has no idea that we're standing. It probably knows we're there, but it doesn't know that we have night vision goggles. So it thinks that we're just like, you know, their naked eye has no idea. Because they're very shy, right? So it's peeking at them, and they're just standing there looking at it. And I'm just like going crazy. I'm just so happy. I'm just like, wow, this thing is so cool. Like, I'm like, this thing is nice. Like, this Sasquatch is just a nice guy. Like, in my mind, I just somehow like knew it. You know, I could be wrong, but in my mind, I'm like, this is a nice guy, Sasquatch. Like, in my mind, it felt like he was a young guy. And it just felt like, it didn't feel like I was looking at an ape or anything either. It felt to me like I was looking at another person, kind of, in a way, like in a big way, actually. It felt like I was like looking at something like so unbelievable, like a scientific discovery, you know. It was just amazing. And so JC tells Bryce to shine the flashlight at it, and that's when the Sasquatch changes its profile, so it makes itself thin to them. Like, you know what I mean? Like, at first it was standing straight head on to them, so it was facing them. And then when he shined the flashlight up, it went behind the pine tree again, but it stood so its profile was towards them. So it made itself thin. So when it did that, we could see the whole backside of it. Or maybe it was facing us. I can't tell from that distance, but we could see the whole body, like, as it was facing us. When we were looking at it before he shined the flashlight, we were looking at its profile until they shined the flashlight at it. Then it changed its profile to them, and we got the full brunt of its body. And the thing was thick. It was broad. And it was just this big, meaty, like, muscular, like, dude. Like, his head went into his shoulders, and it looked like his trapezoids were like, he didn't have a neck. He was all thick muscle and trapezoids going up to his head, is what his body looked like from that perspective. We were only able to look at it from that perspective for just a few moments, because then, now I didn't see this, but, well, I saw some movement, but I didn't see them. But he's like, there's some movement to the right, something else is coming in, there's more coming in. He's like, get out of there now. You know, he didn't want them back there with more coming towards them. So that was pretty exciting too, knowing that there was more. You know, there was more coming to that area. And I mean, it was just like, it was unbelievable. I don't even know how to convey. There's a little bit of fear, obviously, when you think about more coming in. And that's why JD didn't feel that it was safe to stick around, you know, after there was more than one. So he's like, Dad, he's like, JC, get back here, you know. So he called him in, and that's pretty much when, you know, that whole experience ended. They were walking back, and then JD put the goggles down, and JC and Bryce walked back, and we were just all like, oh my gosh, that was so awesome. I'm like, I saw my first Sasquatch, oh my Lord, you know. It was so freaking unreal. Like, it's real, though. Like, it's real. When you see something like that, even if you're a believer, even if you're a researcher like I am, when you finally see something like that, it's like, are my eyes seeing this? Yes, they are. Oh my goodness, that is amazing. So I was pretty excited, and JC was like, yep, I knew it, told you so. We were surrounded. He was like, they're out there, and he's like, they're over here, and the dogmen are over there, apparently, or whatever. So that was that, and you know, while my adrenaline was high and I was all excited, I look at JD and I'm like, you want to head back over there now? He's like, yes. I'm thinking in the back of my mind, I'm like, what did I just get myself into? Yeah, let's do it. Like a striker of the iron's hot. So we tell everyone, we get ready. I put my gear on. I layer up because it's getting colder, and we get ready. You know, we put our weapons in our holster, or I put my sidearm back on. And actually, you know what? JC told me never to take my sidearm off the whole time I was there, just because it's Boogeyman Land. I mean, there's just so much going on there. Obviously, like, he's like, I don't want anything to happen to you. Like, he's like, that's my number one priority is your safety, Jane. He's like, I would never be able to live with myself ever if anything bad happened to you. Like, that is not allowed, and that's not going to happen. So you always have that sidearm on. So, you know, I just never took it off of me. You know, I even slept with it just like right there, you know, like right by my bed. So we're getting ready to go back in. And of course, like I said, there's excitement and nervousness and fear. And while the adrenaline's still coursing through my body, I'm just like, yeah, we got to do this. So we go back in there, we get in the car, and he's got the night vision. I filmed this experience, but I used JC's camcorder. Okay, so I've got the camcorder. He's got the goggles because he's like, Jane, I do not want to have the headlights on if I can't help it because I want to have them come out. You know, that's the whole idea, is to get something on film, right? I'm like, yes. He's like, okay then. He's like, I'm not going to use the headlights unless it's absolutely necessary. And he's doing this, like everything he's doing is like so regulated and trained. Like you can obviously tell he knows what he's doing because he's done this in high stakes situations where lives depend on it, type of thing. So we go into the forest and I've got the camcorder. He doesn't have the headlights on. He's looking through the goggles, and I wasn't very far into it where we're driving along and we hear something go flap on the back of the bumper. That was really, 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 really scary. That was really scary because I just saw the Sasquatch, and I know this sounds like, how do you know for sure, but I know that it wasn't a Sasquatch. I know from the amount of terror and fear that I felt in the daytime, just having that forest go silent and looking at the tracks, the huge tracks, that what hit our car was a dog man. So, and that we can hear it keeping pace with us. And it only, you know, in my mind, I'm like, well, why would it hit our car like that? Is it messing with us? It doesn't want to hurt us. And it's at this time I'm getting pretty scared, really, really scared, because, you know, like I said, it's one thing to hear a story, and it's one thing to write about it, and it's one thing to listen about it all the time. It doesn't matter. You can do all that you want. It doesn't matter. When you have an experience like that, it's happening to you. It's really, really terrifying because it's so unknown. You know, what you're dealing with is just, you just don't know what's going to happen. You don't know a lot about these things. So after that happened, like, I'm just like almost on the verge of tears, and my heart's pounding out of my chest again. And he's like, Jane, get a hold of yourself. He's like, I can hear it following us. I can hear its breath. And he's like, you came out here for this reason, right? And I'm like, yes. He's like, well, you came all the way out here for this. He's like, I know you can do this. He's like, there's no reason to be that scared. He's like, rein it in. He's like, there's no reason to panic. He's like, panic kills. He's like, when you panic, that's when you get yourself killed because you start making stupid decisions. And I'm like, you're right. I know it. So I'm like, okay. So we keep driving, and we're going to take that one trail that leads kind of by the lair. And it's that trail, it's a vehicle trail that leads right through the forest. Like I said, it hadn't rained in days. The ground was hard. It was not soft. It was nothing. It's flat over there. When we got to the trail one of the trails that cut through the forest by the lair, all of a sudden while we were there this time, there was like at least 4 to 6 inches of water flooding it, rushing in from somewhere. That was just so weird. Like, where did the water come from? Why is it rushing like that? There's no irrigation, there's nothing like that. We asked later, and we knew in our heart, like, there's just something really messed up about that. And he didn't like that either. He was like, Jane, that's really weird. He's like, we almost drove through it. He's like, that's a trap. He's like, that's not normal. And, I'm shaking right now as I'm thinking about this. And of course the terror is like mounting, and I'm like, okay, so he's like, that's okay, Jane. He's like, I'm gonna pull out, everything's okay. And we keep on hearing like scratching noises too, by the way, on the side of the vehicle, and it wasn't branches. Like, we'd be in the clearing, we'd hear freaking noises on the car all the time. And he got us out of that area, but we were driving again back into a more clear area, and and we were going to go back. The whole goal of that night was to go towards the OP so we can park a little bit before I get out of the car and look around with the night vision, get it all in camera. That was the whole goal. The mission of the night was to get out of the car at the OP during the nighttime and catch footage to see if we can be at the OP and see a dog man, you know. That was the whole point. So, he kept reminding me of that, you know, because I was like, can we just go back? And he's like, no, he's like, Jane, come on, do you really want to? I'm like, no, okay. So we're driving along, and we're driving parallel to the forest, and like I said, the whole idea is to go back to the OP. So as we're driving parallel to the forest, I look down a grove of clearing where it's like a green belt where it's just grass in between the trees. Like it's a long grove of grass, and there's trees on this side, there's trees on that side, and there's trees behind it. And the moon just happened to be perfectly situated right above that area. I was pretty light without the goggles, and I just happened to be looking out my side, the passenger side window. When I saw down that grove, I see way high up in the trees a head of a dog. And it's so tall up the trees that, well, first of all, I saw the head. I didn't want to keep looking down the body. There was just too much going on that night that was scaring me, that I didn't want to see what the body looked like. And I know that sounds however, but I just couldn't handle that. All I could handle was just making sure that I saw what I saw. And what I saw was really thin, pointing ears, you know, the classical description. Like, in my mind, I'm like, German Shepherd. I'm like, wait, no, more like Doberman, because they're so pert and pointy and like tall. And the thing is, like, that head was really wide. And the fur, from what I can tell from the distance where I was like black with like silvery tips or something, like silvery. And I could see it facing me, and just the top of its head, if that makes sense, like illuminated from the moon. And I looked at it for a few seconds, but I couldn't look at it. I didn't want to see I did not want to see its body. I did not want to see it. That would be too much. Because all I could, plus, it was really dark too. And the thing that it was so tall. That was what bended my mind the most, was that it's so far up off the ground. Like, the mind is just not meant to look at that and reconcile it with nature, because it's just not normal. You don't see a dog head high, 8 feet off the ground. You're not set up to see that. So your eyeballs, when you take in that visual information, you're just like, what? So it was just too much for me. So I looked away. And at this point, I don't know if I'm like whimpering or like, but I'm like, John, I just saw one, and he's like, okay. He's like, okay, well, he's like, did it move? I'm like, no, I didn't want to look at it, JD. I didn't want to look at it. It was stationary. And I'm like, can we please just keep going? And he's like, well, we're going to keep with the mission, because it didn't move, it didn't advance on us, and it didn't threaten us. So we're going to try to complete our mission, Jane. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. And I'm just like floating in some kind of like, I'm just going to do this. I'm determined, But I'm just like, the more that we keep going, the more in my mind, I'm like, I don't want to he can get out of the car if he wants. I'm like, but no, he can't leave me. He cannot get out of the car. I'm like, I don't want to get out of the car. In my mind, I'm like, if we get to the OP, I just want to stay in the vehicle and watch. I do not want to get out of the car with this thing that's right there. Like, I would be insane. I have 2 little girls at home. That would be freaking crazy. So we're driving, and we're like almost there. We're really close to the OP, and he's at a point where he's like, we should get out now. And he's like, see, Jane, he's like, is anything bad happening now? And I'm like, no. He's like, did the dog man, he saw it didn't move, right? I'm like, no. He's like, it just stood there, right? I'm like, well, yeah. And he's like, well, so it's non-threatening, right? And I'm like, I guess so. I'm like, it's really scary, JD. He's like, yeah, I know. He's like, but this is why you came out here. This is cutting edge, you know. This is the footage that you want. I'm like, I know. He's like, okay. He's like, he had this flashlight, and he's like, here. He's like, I'm going to show you. I'm going to shine the flashlight out to the left. I'm going to show you that there's nothing there. You know, we're going to look before we get out that there's nothing there. So he turned on the flashlight. He started to shine it out to the left, and he did, and then boom, it went out. And then, by the way, I had my phone that was like 50-60% charged battery in the glove compartment too, just for an emergency. That I later found out was completely drained, and like so drained that it took like a few hours just for it to turn back on while it was plugged in. So, but anyway, like, so that happened, and he was like, okay. And, you know, I'm getting real scared again, real scared again. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to go out. He's like, okay, so after the flashlight thing happens, we look at each other and we're like, okay, that was weird. And then a few moments later, like, we hear a thud again on the car. And this time it was just, it was horrible because this time it was too much for him. He decided, you know, the car was still on. He decided to drive, and the car was still on, so he wanted to get out of there. And I'm really scared. And he's like, he pushes the accelerator down, and it doesn't work. He's pushing it down again and again and again, and it doesn't work. And in my mind, I'm like, well, you know, when these things happen, you know, when a person gets into a car accident, and I've been in a couple, like, things happen so quick, your brain is still able to process it and still try to, like, make reason of the sequence of events. So in my mind, even though all that stuff just took moments to happen, in my mind, I'm like, oh my gosh, the electricity system and everything is failing. So that must mean, like, the electricity system in the car is failing, and we're going to be stuck out here. It's trapping us. It's going to hurt us. And so that's going on in my mind, and he's trying to get out of there, and it's not letting us. But eventually, after like the fourth or fifth tap down, slammed down with his foot on the accelerator, he was able to drive. And like I said, we heard that flap again. It was really loud and hard, and it made the car move. And eventually he was able to drive away. And I'm really scared at this point. I'm just like thinking that I might die, you know, because I don't know why it would do something like that. And you know, it was just so frightening. I didn't know what was going to happen next. It was the whole thing that made it so scary. And it was just helplessness, just complete loss of control of what's happening. So we were able to get out of there, and we had to go slow too on top of it. And we can tell something was following us and keeping pace with us. So we couldn't even go that fast because we didn't want to get stuck if there was mud or something. So we were driving slowly, and we eventually made it out of there. And when we were close enough to the house, you know, I tried to call JC, but obviously my phone was dead. His phone was dead too. And when we got close to the property, we saw that all of them were in JC's car, in his Jeep, I mean. And we saw the headlights facing us as we were approaching the property closer, and we all get out of our car. And JC's like, where were you guys? And we're like, well, we were investigating. JD was saying, and he's like, well, are you guys okay? And he's like, you guys were gone for a really long time. And I just, you know, he drove me up to the car, or up to the house, and I was just so frightened. I was just so scared, and I told everyone eventually what happened, and they could see how scared I was, and I think I was crying, or trying not to cry. I was trying to be tough and brave, and I guess I was, because, you know, other people would not set foot into that woods, but, so I told them all, and well, they there was like a witch hunt after that, like a couple hours, no, not even a couple hours, like an hour later, everyone was in a truck ready to go back there and see what was going on, like what terrified Jane in that bed, you know, they were kind of like, what the, you know, but, that's pretty much my dogman encounter. I saw it, you know, I saw the head. It was really, really tall. It was really high off the ground. There's no mistaking what I saw. It was a dog head. It was a big dog head.
Well, that was the last eyewitness of the night. Thanks as always so much for listening. Have a great night and a great new year.